Final Fantasy XIV is one of the most popular MMORPGs to this day, but it wasn't always this way. Before its massive success, Final Fantasy XIV had a humble beginning with a Realm Reborn. For many, a Realm Reborn is simply an obstacle in the way of the greater Final Fantasy XIV experience. But for some of us, a Realm Reborn was the game, and there wasn't a Heavensward, Stormblood, Shadowbringers, or Endwalker. There was just a Realm Reborn, and that was it. So, in this video, I'm going to talk you through how a Realm Reborn came to be and how it was during that era, because I don't think enough people truly realize just how much the game has changed in the past 10 years and the impact a Realm Reborn has had, and what better way to talk about it than through a video. Throughout this video, I'll be using Endwalker as a basis of comparison, as that's the current expansion as of the recording of this video, and it's perfectly 10 years apart from a Realm Reborn. I'm fully aware that by the time you're watching this video, the current expansion could very well much be Dawn Trail, or even 8.0, and if so, that's pretty great, because I aim to make this video as evergreen as possible. But with that said, let's talk about the history of the history. E3 2009, Square Enix reveals their brand new Crystal Tools engine MMORPG coming to the PlayStation 3 and PC, Final Fantasy XIV. Square Enix's modern take on the MMORPG genre using its most valuable IP. December the 16th, 2009, beta sign-ups for the PC version begun, with a PS3 sign-up at a later date. That later date never came to be, because Final Fantasy XIV didn't launch on the PlayStation 3. Yes, we're talking about 1.0. PlayStation players didn't really miss out though, with the beta turning out to be a complete mess, with players reporting performance issues, bugs, gameplay concerns. The game was just not fun and felt unfinished. Despite the feedback, Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 launched on September the 30th, 2010. After all, what's the worst that can happen? Alpha and beta tests are always rough around the edges, and launches are hard to get right. They can just patch away their problems in the future, right? Well, yes and no. 1.0 launched in an almost unsalvageable state. But just saying that doesn't really give you a good idea of just how bad it was. So let me paint a clearer picture for you. And what better way to do that than talk about the most important aspect of any MMORPG, the actual gameplay. The UI and combat of 1.0 was as if the developers just straight up copied Final Fantasy XI, and if you've played FF11, you'll know the combat is very slow and navigating the UI menus isn't exactly the most user-friendly thing. Simply opening your inventory would require multiple clicks, unless you made macros, when something as simple as opening your inventory should just be a default hotkey. The combat, on the other hand, did have hotkeys, but it was so excruciatingly slow and clunky, and there wasn't even auto attacks. So in the early levels, you were forced into just pressing one button over and over and over again. Now, these aren't inherently bad things, mind you. But the MMORPG genre has moved past this point and evolved. It's not going to get popularity when standing up to the likes of World of Warcraft with a combat system this slow. An old MMO like FF11 had slow combat because back then, people didn't have broadband connection. They had dial-up, and that was slow. So to account for this, combat being slow made sense. It really is especially polarizing why they decided to go this route, because if someone wants to play FF11, they could simply play FF11. And trust me, as someone who plays both 14 and FF11, I can appreciate the two very different approaches for their two different times. FF11 isn't for everyone, and that's okay. You could argue then that making FF14 wasn't going to be for everyone either then. But the difference is, when making an MMO, especially in this day and age. You want to aim to attract as many people as possible during that period of the era. MMOs are not cheap to make and are considered a huge investment by a company and a massive risk. And again, during FF14's 1.0 debut, World of Warcraft was the reigning champion. So if you were going to make an MMO, you had to have a good reason to get people to play your game over World of Warcraft. And 1.0's outdated combat and features just weren't cutting it. There were some positives to the gameplay though, like attacks felt really weighty and impactful. You could change your class by simply switching your weapon, and the cross-class system essentially let you cross any ability you wanted from any other class, allowing you to make your own unique version of classes in a way. Still, in this case, the good just couldn't outweigh the bad. But hey, how about the story? Maybe it can redeem the title. Because remember, this is a Final Fantasy game, a mainline at that. Well, about that. There was no real story, and the characters were just uninteresting, at least at the time, which isn't ideal for a Final Fantasy title when story is such an important part of the series. The game was also just severely lacking in terms of content, except for leveling and hunting notorious monsters, and leveling was limited by an experience fatigue system that would encourage you to stop playing, so you would become less fatigued. This was reset on a weekly basis. However, you could switch classes to rank up another class or level up a profession, which is what most players resorted to doing. It's worth mentioning that in 1.0, you had a physical level and a class level, which were two different things. Your physical level determined your overall stats, and your class rank or level unlocked more abilities. But both of these things still required experience points. So ranking up another class was still limited due to where you got the majority of your EXP from, which was quests in the form of levs, and you could only accept up to 8 a day, which just screamed mobile game. The only reasoning for this, I can imagine, is because they don't want their players to forget their friends and family as stated in this text. But limiting this is just bad design. Playtime, in my opinion, is responsibility of either you, an adult, or a parent monitoring their child's playtime. But speaking of the classes, that's all they were. Classes and not jobs. You know, the thing that is iconic to a lot of Final Fantasies? Yeah, well, players here had the choice between Gladiator, Marauder, Lancer, Pugilist, Thaumaturge, and Conjurer. Exciting. Traversing the world was also made painful by its awful map layout. No jumping or falling down ledges, and the areas just being vast amounts of land, copy and pasted. But hey, there was no loading between areas at least. And that isn't even going over the teleport system. If you wanted to teleport anywhere, you first had to unlock the Aetheryte, which is pretty standard, but it also costs a separate currency to gill known as Anima. Anima capped at 100 and generated 1 every 4 real-time hours. Run out of Anima in the middle of nowhere, well, you're running all the way back. As for the cities, well, vendors weren't actually marked as vendors, so you would have to click NPCs to figure out who's a vendor and who isn't. And there was also no market board. Instead, if you wanted to buy from other players, they had to set themselves up as a bazaar. Then you had to interact with them scattered throughout major cities and navigate between each and every single one of them until you find the item you're looking for, if you were lucky. Character creator was also very limited, with only a few options to pick from and 3 gender-locked races, Rugadin and Highlander being male only and Makote being female only. And there wasn't much in the ways of personalization either, which means you'd sooner or later run into your clone through another player or NPC. And for an MMO, that isn't great. Your avatar is an extension of yourself, so you want to feel unique and special in a way. And we haven't even gone over the technical issues 1.0 dealt with. The servers were a complete unstable mess, with upwards of 400 crashes a day across the board, multiple bug issues, lag affecting crafting and gathering, and that's not even getting into the awful system that was crafting and gathering, with crafting not even having a recipe list, and gathering being this frustrating minigame rather than just being a chill or fun activity. And if that isn't bad enough, the game was also plagued by performance issues. Things like flower pots had 1000 polygons and 150 lines of shader code, which is the equivalent to a player character. To add to this, the game only displayed 20 characters on screen at the same time, and let me remind you, this is an MMORPG, just in case you weren't aware. Admittedly, the game did look really good for its time, probably one of the best looking MMORPGs in the market, with pretty stunning environments and fantastic looking cutscenes. But this came at the cost of severe performance issues, which is not a good trade in my opinion, and well, the opinion of mostly everyone else. Does that even make it an opinion anymore? But honestly, just look at the frame rate of the footage I'm showing you. It's awful. I think by now, you get the point. There is a lot more to say about it, but I didn't play 1.0, and to be honest, I'm glad I didn't. 1.0 was bad for a multitude of reasons, and this can be contributed towards several points. One of those being the complete lack of MMORPG experience the development team at the time had. Because, let's face it, they really did just look at FF11 and decided, yeah, this will work in 2010. Time where World of Warcraft reigns and the MMORPG has vastly evolved. There was just a complete lack of understanding of how far the MMORPG genre has come up to this point. And that's not even mentioning how the game was just rushed to release in an unfinished state. And so the game was rightfully so reviewed very harshly. I mean, just listen to some of these reviews.
But suffice it to say, Final Fantasy XIV is not the online RPG you should be playing.
But as of right now, this is not a world worth visiting.
There are too many good MMOs on the market for you to spend your time and money on this broken, incomplete mess.
Yeah, pretty brutal, right? But all of that was totally justified. And this did look pretty bad on Square Enix for a titled Final Fantasy to do this poorly. They had to salvage this one way or another, but how? Luckily, they had a very knowledgeable MMORPG developer on hand. December the 3rd, 2010, a mere 3 months after the initial launch of 1.0, Yoshi P and his team took over the development of Final Fantasy XIV. I'm sure you know Yoshi P, but if you don't, he's an experienced MMORPG player and developer of Dragon Quest X, which was another MMORPG. And with this, things started to actually look bright for the future of Final Fantasy XIV, which I'm sure you know. Just a little over a week since the restructured team took over, the game would see numerous updates addressing bugs and other issues within the game, and even added the official forums for feedback purposes. A few months after that, the game saw major updates, overhauling the battle system, ridding the janky player trading, and adding in the market board, adding auto attacks, and real endgame content like dungeons with Aurum Vale, Cutter's Cry, and Decimal Darkhold, trial fights like Ifrit, Garuda, and Nail Van Darness, adding in an actual story and evolving classes into iconic Final Fantasy jobs like Paladin and Dragoon. Then Yoshi P would hold his very first live letter, which he would use to communicate with the player base about the state of the game and its future, a trend we see continue up to this day. And so the game was finally okay. The story was salvaged, the endgame was serviceable, bugs were more or less crushed, and a lot of glaring issues were changed. But the game just still had a really bad reputation, and the hope of growth past pleasing the current veterans were pretty dire. Just like with anything, to truly grow and expand, you have to do something substantial. Something that can get a lot of attention, and that's especially difficult when your game has such a bad reputation. But Yoshi P had this crazy idea of burning everything down and remaking it from the ground up. So, on November the 11th, 2012, the final day of 1.0 was happening. Cities were under siege by monsters, and the moon would dawn down upon the world, glowing with this eerily red hue, and kind of count down the final minutes before the complete and utter destruction of 1.0. Once the clock ticked that final second, all players were logged out, but in exchange they were given this climactic cinematic, an event that is directly tied into the lore and referred to as the Calamity. And that was the final day of Final Fantasy XIV 1.0. After that, it was shut down forever, never to be played again. Usually, when an MMO doesn't do well, they simply shut down, never to be played again, and eventually forgotten about, being reduced to a mere page in the MMO history books, which is an unfortunate fate for a lot of MMOs. But Final Fantasy XIV had other plans, and so on October the 14th, 2011, the announcement of Final Fantasy: A Realm Reborn happened, with an alpha and beta test to follow. The reception over the course of these tests were mostly well received, and promised a completely overhauled combat, crafting, and gathering systems with a brand new engine to boot, expanded character creation with gender-locked race restrictions removed on Makote, Highlander, and Rugadon, a brand new class, Arcanist, with 2 additional jobs, Summoner and Scholar, an actual story and redesigned quest structure, buttery smooth performance, mostly bug-free, and upheld the promise of a PlayStation 3 release. There were of course some server crashes and frustrations over login times, but that's to be expected from a beta. Either way, A Realm Reborn seemed really promising. With the 1.0 servers being shut down, the wait for A Realm Reborn begun, with an open beta test on the 16th of August 2014 for people to try out the game, and then not long after the release of the game. For all it's worth, 1.0 did lay a good foundation for A Realm Reborn to flourish with its really good world building, lore, and art assets, even if they were just taken from FF11. But I bet you're eager to hear about what you actually came here for. A Realm Reborn during its era. August the 27th, 2013. A Realm Reborn releases and is received with mostly positive reviews and praise, which means Yoshi P's crazy idea actually paid off, and his team successfully relaunched one of the most disastrous MMORPGs to date, a feat which has since never been repeated by any other competitor. But let's actually talk about this new game. Arguably the most important aspect of any MMORPG is the combat, as you'll be spending the majority of your time with it. A Realm Reborn changed a lot from 1.0 by creating a traditional yet modern combat system with a 2.5 second global cooldown and off global cooldown to keep combat feeling constant. This revolves around 2 core mechanics, the global cooldown, or GCD, which effectively keeps you pressing different buttons every few seconds to keep it rolling, and the off global cooldown, or OGCD, which provides the player with a plethora of other buttons to press during the GCD downtime. This gave combat that constant flow and engagement that 1.0 lacked. To complement the global and off-global cooldown, A Realm Reborn uses a tab targeting system to select targets, similar to World of Warcraft. In fact, the combat system of A Realm Reborn is heavily inspired by World of Warcraft, but does things different enough to make it its own thing. Take the combo system, for example. Melees in Final Fantasy XIV use combos to keep their global cooldown running. The premise is simple: 3 or so skills used one after each other, resulting in significant potency gains, buffs, and debuffs. Combos in A Realm Reborn also only lasted a few seconds, compared to now, where they last 30 seconds. Some of these attacks also had positional requirements that must be executed from a target's rear or flank for increased potencies, buffs, and debuffs. GCDs also required TP or MP for casters. TP would slowly regenerate over time, and usually this resource wouldn't run out except in full uptime encounters, but if it did, you'd be waiting on your TP to recover. Thankfully, there was a solution to this, and they were called bards. Bards in A Realm Reborn were the support, with access to 3 songs: Army's Paean, Mage's Ballad, and Foe Requiem. Army's Paean would refresh TP, important for melees and tanks, while Mage's Ballad would refresh MP, which was important for healers. Foe Requiem, however, debuffed enemies with a 10% less magic resistance, effectively giving your magic DPS and healers 10% more damage. Kind of. All 3 of these songs had cast times to activate and slowly drained the Bard's MP. Army's Paean and Mage's Ballad also reduced the damage the Bard did by 20% during their effects. To further increase the potency of these songs, Bards also had access to Battle Voice, an OGCD which would double the effectiveness of any current song. There were of course other ways to get TP and MP back, like melees and bards having the Dragoon cross-class action Invigorate, which restored TP, and Ninja's Goad, which would refresh TP to a target. As for healers, White Mage had Shroud of Saints, which refreshed MP and reduced enmity by half, and Scholars had Aetherflow, which instantly restored MP and gave stacks of Aetherflow. In A Realm Reborn, your MP pool depended on your job and how much piety you had. The more piety, the bigger your pool. Now compare all that to Endwalker, TP has been removed, and MP is a static 1000 across all jobs. To make up for this, Bard's songs were also changed. Although it still has 3 songs, these function completely differently and are more just 3 different phases to Bard's damage rotation. Battle Voice also still exists, but it's simply a raid buff. Overall, it's quite the stark difference. Although Bard is still considered supportive now, in A Realm Reborn, it was definitely a lot more active in its supportive role, as it had to sacrifice its own damage to refresh the party's TP or MP. That said, that didn't make it any less of a DPS compared to other jobs, as Bards in A Realm Reborn had the most OGCD buffs out of all the jobs, including Raging Strikes, Hawk's Eye, Internal Release, Blood for Blood, and Barrage. This gave it an incredible burst potential and could sometimes even steal aggro off tanks if they didn't use their ability Quelling Strikes, which reduced enmity. That's a lot of buffs, and some of these abilities weren't even exclusive to Bard, which is where the cross-class abilities come in. A system borrowed from 1.0, but heavily changed. In A Realm Reborn, every job could cross-class up to 5 abilities from 2 other jobs. For Bard, it was Dragoon and Monk, and the 2 most popular cross-class actions from these 2 jobs were Blood for Blood and Internal Release, straight up adding 2 more OGCDs to Bard's already impressive arsenal of OGCDs. Cross-class abilities were important to every job, and to unlock more, you'd have to level the available jobs your job could cross-class with. For example, Bard could cross-class with Dragoon and Monk. If a Bard wanted Blood for Blood, they would have to level Dragoon up to level 34. Also, as a little fun fact, to unlock a job in A Realm Reborn, you needed another class level to 15. For Bard, this was Pugilist. Pretty odd, I know, which is probably why that requirement has since been abolished. Also, if you wanted even more cross-class abilities, you could remove your Jobstone, which let you cross-class any skill that is cross-classable and not be limited by the 2 classes your job has access to, which made for some pretty fun challenge runs with Marauders having extra stuff like Blood for Blood and Raging Strikes, but it wasn't as optimal as you'd miss out on the extra job abilities and stats. There are a few other random things Bard had, like Repelling Shot. This used to do damage, so it was encouraged to press whenever it was off cooldown, which sometimes resulted in some pretty stupid deaths compared to now where it just doesn't do potency. It also had Flaming Arrow, which was just a ground-placed OGCD AoE, which was nothing special, so I guess that's why it got the axe. It also had 2 AoE attacks, but they didn't combo off each other, so it was left down to choice. Quick Knock, that did 110 potency in a cone, costing 140 TP, or Wide Volley, that did 110 potency, but in an AoE around the target, and cost 160 TP. So the most common use was Quick Knock due to its TP efficiency, but in some rare cases, Wide Volley was used. I should probably also mention execution abilities while we're here, because Bard had one, Misery's End, which could only be used when a target was below 20%. A few other jobs had these kind of actions like Warrior's Mercy Stroke and Ninja's Assassinate, but these have since been changed or removed, as they didn't really add much value to the actual gameplay, other than adding in an extra button when bosses were below 20% health. Bards also had a way to actively mitigate damage with Rain of Death, reducing the target's damage done by 10% for 20 seconds in an AoE around the target, which still exists today but is an OGCD and shares a cooldown with Bloodladder. Bloodladder in A Realm Reborn had a 20% chance to reset for every dot tick from Venomous and Windbite applied to a target, which is somewhat similar to how Mage's Ballad works now without the reliance on dots. Something also similar to now, but also not really, is Straight Shot. In A Realm Reborn, this still procced from Heavy Shot, but you could use it without the proc. The proc itself just made Straight Shot a guaranteed crit, and it also gave a 20-second buff to increase your critical hit rate by 10%. So you'd want to use this before applying or reapplying your dots, as they could crit back then. There was also no Iron Jaws. That was a Heavensward ability, so you had to manually reapply both of your dots. Bards also had a way to silence with Blunt Arrow. Silencing in A Realm Reborn is how interrupting works now, except there wasn't a clear indicator that something could be silenced, so you had to learn the abilities that could be silenced through experience. They also had Shadowbind, which was removed in favor of the crossroll action Foot Graze, and has the exact same functionality of binding a target. Did I mention that Bard's limit break for A Realm Reborn was actually a healer limit break? It wasn't until Heavensward introduced Machinist and made physical range its own role for them to give Bard an actual damage dealing limit break. Still, this healing limit break made for some really great clutch moments. Melees in A Realm Reborn consisted of Dragoon, Monk, and later Ninja. Endwalker's Dragoon has 2 core combos to it. True Thrust into Vorpal Thrust, into Heaven's Thrust, into Fang and Claw, and finishing with Reeling Thrust, and True Thrust into Disembowel, into Chaotic Spring, into Wheeling Thrust, and finishing with Fang and Claw. A Realm Reborn was a bit different. It still had these two core combos, but without the extension of Fanging Claw and Wheeling Thrust, but it also had the addition of Impulse Drive, Heavy Thrust, and Phlebotomize. Impulse Drive was used in place of True Thrust for the Disembowel into Chaos Thrust combo, while Phlebotomize was a standalone damage over time effect, and Heavy Thrust was a standalone GCD which had to be executed from the target's flank for more potency and a 10% damage buff. But here's the catch. If you fail to hit this attack from the flank, not only would you lose the increased potency, but you also wouldn't gain the buff. And this was the same for every positional requirement in A Realm Reborn. If you didn't hit Impulse Drive from the target's rear, well, you couldn't continue the combo and you'd have to do another Impulse Drive. That was pretty punishing, especially in a time where True North didn't exist, and that's not even going over the OGCDs. A Realm Reborn Dragoon used to have an ability called Blood for Blood, which increased damage dealt by 30%, but also increased damage received by 25% for 20 seconds. That's pretty significant, and if used during a bad time, it could easily result in the Dragoon dying. Now compare that to Endwalker's Lance Charge, which replaced Blood for Blood, and this simply increases damage dealt by 10% for 20 seconds. To add to this, Dragoons still had jumps, but these had extremely punishing animation locks, and if used at a bad time, usually resulted in their deaths. This and Blood for Blood is where the LOL Dragoon joke comes from, if you ignore it from FF11, because so many Dragoons would fall victim to using these abilities at a bad time. They also had a lot less magic resistance in their gear on release. This was eventually changed, but this definitely contributed heavily towards Dragoons dying to raid wides randomly. Some little fun things is Elusive Jump. This used to actually reduce your enmity when enmity management was a thing, and they could also buff their jump or Spine Shadow Dive by 50% with Power Surge, which just felt kind of bloaty. Now compare that to Endwalker. Jumps are incredibly fast, Power Surge was removed, and the animation locks are nigh-existent, save for Stardiver. A few more random things Dragoon had included Feint, which unlike the Feint today was a GCD and slowed the target for 20 seconds, which was great if you wanted to slow down the cast of enemies in dungeons, but useless in raids because bosses are immune to crowd control effects. Dragoon also, funnily enough, had a defensive, personal Keen Flurry, which increased parry rate by 80% for 20 seconds, which wasn't great because, yeah, sure, the chance to parry was high, but parry also only works on physical damage, and not having 100% reliability on a defensive is just kinda bad. There was also Ring of Thorns, which was this AoE ability that comboed off Heavy Thrust, and was just a circle around the Dragoon, and was really obnoxious in towns. Either way, I digress. You'd want to use this after using Heavy Thrust, and then Doomspike spam until you need to Heavy Thrust and Ring of Thorns again. And lastly, we had Leg Sweep, which did 130 potency and stunned an enemy for 3 seconds, which did actually see use, but you'd want to wait for a tank to stun first, as their stuns lasted longer, and so the enemy doesn't build an early resistance to stuns. Leg Sweep still exists today, but as a cross-roll action for all melee, and no longer has potency tied to it. Oh, and before I forget, that's not even going over the piercing debuff. Whenever a Dragoon used Disembowel, the target would take 10% more damage from piercing, which sounds cool, right? I'll take 10% more damage any day of the week. But the problem was Bards also did piercing damage, and they had no way to inflict this debuff themselves, which made them rely on Dragoons. And this, of course, made a lot of Bards want Dragoons in their group, which was fine until they added Ninja to the mix. Thankfully in Endwalker, Disembowel simply gives the Dragoon a 10% personal damage buff, and resistance down debuffs have since been removed. Monks have also seen significant changes. Take their 6 core GCDs for example: Dragon Kick, Boot Shine, Twin Snakes, True Strike, Snap Punch, and Demolish. All of these required a positional requirement and have seen their benefits slightly changed. Take Dragon Kick for example. This used to give the target a 10% blunt resistance down and intelligence down debuff. Now compare this to Endwalker, only Snap Punch and Demolish have positionals, and Dragon Kick now instead grants the Leaden Fist buff, which guarantees the next Boot Shine to be a critical hit. A few other things that were removed or changed include Monk's AoE attack, Armor the Destroyer, which used to have a silence effect attached to it, Touch of Death, a standalone dot that did not require a form, Internal Release, an OGCD that increased critical hit rate up by 30% for 15 seconds. Haymaker, an attack that could be executed when dodging an attack and gave the target a slow effect for 20 seconds, which was cool, but the use case for this was really niche. I guess they wanted you to use this with Featherfoot, which increased evasion rate by 25% for 15 seconds. Monks also had this random ass ability, One Aeon Punch, that removed one beneficial effect from a target. It's kind of crazy to think how many of these niche type abilities a Realm Reborn had, but it makes sense as jobs didn't have nearly as many buttons as they do now. Steel Peak and Howling Fist still existed, but were just OGCDs without chakra tied to them. And Steel Peak was also Monk's stun, and Mantra did the same effect, but slightly more powerful in a Realm Reborn, but it did have a really small range compared to now. Gap closers have seen some interesting changes too. Shoulder Tackle, Monk's gap closer, had a 20 yalm range, dealt 100 potency, stunned the target, but you had to be more than 10 yalms away from the target you want to shoulder tackle to. And I distinctly remember some monks running away from a boss just to use this ability for the increased potency. Was that worth over losing potential auto attacks and GCDs? Most likely not, but it still happened. Now monks have Thunderclap that does no damage, but can be used on allies and enemies, and has free charges. A worthy trade-off, I'd say. Monks also had several of these stances: Fists of Earth, which reduced damage taken by 10%, Fists of Wind, which increased movement speed, and Fists of Fire, which increased damage dealt by 5%. Only one stance could be active at a time, but a good monk knew how to switch between the three, with Fists of Fire being the default. Compare that to Endwalker's Monk, which instead uses Riddle of Earth, Wind, and Fire, all granting beneficial buffs and can be used together. One of the most significant changes to Monk, however, is Grease Lightning. In A Realm Reborn, monks held up to 3 stacks. Each stack collected increased damage dealt by 7%, reduced auto attack delay by 5%, and lasted 12 seconds, but could be collected and refreshed through Snap Punch, Demolish, and Rock Breaker. While in Endwalker, Grease Lightning is simply a trait. Grease Lightning, in my opinion, made Monk's gameplay have this high stakes, high reward feeling to it, as you didn't want to drop your stacks, as that would be a massive damage loss and you'd have to start over to get them again, which could be pretty slow, but thankfully it did have perfect balance, which could be used to quickly acquire your 3 stacks back. It was, however, on a fat 240-second cooldown. Despite Endwalker's Monk not having Grease Lightning stacks to monitor, I still feel like it has plenty going for it to keep the gameplay feeling fresh and rewarding, with its high level of optimization available to it. And that was all the melee until 2.4 came along and added Ninja. And that was the first and last time they've ever added a non-limited job in a patch. Ninja's main mechanic has to be its ability to combine unique mudgers to execute a wide variety of ninjutsu abilities. In Endwalker, this is all done within the GCD, but in A Realm Reborn, this was all done within the OGCD window, which meant clipping into your GCD a lot. And it didn't feel great, but this was simply the way of the ninja. Ninjutsu abilities pretty much remained the same throughout the years, however for GCD abilities it did lack Armor Crush, which means there was no way to refresh Huton, which meant you had to manually recast it with ninjutsu. At the time, that was all we knew, but revisiting A Realm Reborn content and it sure does feel jarring. It did, however, have some other GCDs that don't exist today, like Shadow Fang, and a way to apply the slashing debuff, Dancing Edge. Ideally, a warrior would be keeping the slashing debuff up low, as having to use Dancing Edge meant one less Alonian Edge every 20 seconds, but if the party lacked a warrior, then Ninja could apply it themselves. Ninja also had these 2 poisons, which have since been removed, and the OGCD's Trick and Sneak Attack, which have also been changed or removed. These 2 poisons, which were more like stances, Kiss of the Wasp and Kiss of the Viper. Both of these eventually upgraded to increase physical damage by 20%, but had different extra effects to them. Kiss of the Wasp changed the Jugulate effect from a silence to a stun, and Kiss of the Viper changed Mug effects from increased chance of additional items being dropped to a lifesteal, absorbing 50% of damage dealt into HP. These 2 stances were removed in Stormblood, and I'm not complaining because they didn't really serve a purpose other than being some relic of the past. As for the OGCDs, Trick Attack used to increase the damage the target took by 10% for 10 seconds on a 60-second cooldown, which was pretty f***ing broken, and I don't say that lightly. Possibly the only con with Trick Attack was you had to hit the trick from the rear, otherwise the debuff wouldn't apply, which was pretty punishing. This ability was a huge problem though, because it made Ninja a must in groups. And remember how bards wanted dragoons in their party? Yeah, this was pretty bad. It made monks an outcast amongst the melee, not offering anything to their group except their own personal damage. It's not like monks weren't taken into high-end content, because trust me, they were, but Ninja and Dragoon simply outweighed the benefits of taking a monk. Trick Attack in Endwalker does almost the same thing, but rather than making the target take 10% more damage from everyone, it takes 10% more damage from the ninja alone. To make up for this, Mug increases the damage a target takes by 5% for 20 seconds on a 2-minute cooldown, which keeps things a lot more balanced. Oh, and before I forget, Sneak Attack, which had to be executed from the target's front for extra potency, but it didn't apply the vulnerability and shared a cooldown with Trick. It has since been removed, and you can probably figure out why, because it was just never used. And one last thing, Ninja also had the ability Perfect Dodge, which completely dodged the next physical attack. As amazing as it was, keeping such an ability on a DPS would cause problems in the future when it comes to fight design. So you now know this ability as Shade Shift, which just shields the Ninja for 20% of their max HP pool. Caster DPS are the last DPS sub-role to talk about. In our Realm Reborn, we just had Black Mage and Summoner. And honestly, if you've played Black Mage on Realm Reborn content, then you'll know how this job used to play, because it remains one of the most unchanged jobs throughout the game. Its core gameplay loop of going from Umbral Ice to Astral Fire was the same. Keeping Thunder up and using your remaining MP on Flare all pretty much remain the same if you were to play level 50 Black Mage in Endwalker. Although the 5-star proc from Fire 1 used to be really delayed and almost impossible to immediately follow up without clipping into your GCD, which thankfully is no longer an issue. There are some interesting OGCDs, however, that either got the axe, changed up, or turned into crossrow actions, and we're going to talk about them. Shortcast and Swiftcast were both Black Mage abilities, but were cross-classable. Thunder was also, interestingly enough, cross-classable, and these cross-class abilities were available to Summoner, Scholar, and White Mage, which meant if you wanted to Swiftcast Res, you needed to level Black Mage to level 26. Shortcast also didn't have the knockback immunity effect, but it did have this weird trait upgrade that gave it a 15% chance to reset upon use. And Thunder was actually used as an extra dot by Summoners, Scholars, and White Mages. Now Shortcast and Swiftcast are simply role abilities, and Thunder is exclusive to Black Mage. Blizzard 2, Freeze, and Convert have also seen some changes. Blizzard 2 used to be an AoE around the Black Mage, meanwhile Freeze used to be a ground-placed AoE. They both bound enemies hit by them, and Blizzard 1 even heavy targets. In Endwalker, these are AoEs around the target, making them a lot easier to use, and the ice spells no longer have the crowd control effects attached to them, which is kind of sad. Even though it was mostly just a flavor thing, it did add some charm to the ice spells. Either way, moving on, we had Convert, which sacrificed 20% of the Black Mage's HP in exchange for 30% of their MP back, on a 180-second cooldown. Just like Dragoon's Blood for Blood, you wouldn't want to use this at a bad time. Convert in Endwalker has since been changed to Mana Font, which simply restores 30% total MP back to the Black Mage on a 120-second cooldown, removing the risk of Convert. Black Mage also had a few abilities that have since been removed, which include Lethargy, Apocastasis, and Mana Wall. Lethargy slowed and heavied a target for 20%, which was cool in dungeons, and that was about it, for the same reason as other crowd control abilities. Apocastasis was neat because it essentially reduced magic damage taken by 30% on a targeted party member, which was mostly handy for squishies for raid wides. Take Dragoon for example, which had less magic resistance to magic damage than any other job, or maybe for a tank on a magical tank buster. And lastly, we have Mana Wall, which completely negated 2 physical attacks for 60 seconds on a 120-second cooldown. And yeah, you can probably figure out why they had to remove this, because it allowed Black Mages to straight up ignore mechanics that involved physical damage. Oh, and the crossrow action Sleep, this used to be a Black Mage exclusive ability. Just a fun little fact before we move on. For our final DPS and caster, we have Summoner, and this job has changed a lot, but that's mostly thanks to Endwalker completely overhauling the job. Still, it's worth talking about how it worked in A Realm Reborn. Summoner was very much a dot-based caster, none of that LEGO bullshit it's got going on in Endwalker. Its core dots were Bio, Bio 2, and Miasma, and it could even add an extra dot with Miasma 2, which was an AoE dot, and Shadow Flare, a ground-placed AoE. Its spammable single target spell was Ruin 1, Ruin 2 for movement, and Tri-Disaster for AoE, which was awful, but it was something, I guess. It could even capitalize on Bio, Bio 2, and Miasma with Festa, which did 100 potency per dot. Funnily enough, in Endwalker, it does a flat 340 potency. Festa required Aetherflow stacks, which were acquired by using Aetherflow, which restored 20% of your MP and gave you 3 Aetherflow stacks and allowed the usage of Festa and Energy Drain, which also restored MP. In Endwalker, you only get 2 Aetherflow stacks, and those are acquired by using Energy Drain. Summoner also had access to 3 pets, Ifrit, Titan, and Garuda, which work completely differently to how they work in Endwalker. Ifrit was the melee pet, Titan a tank, and Garuda a ranged pet, all of which had HP and could die. With Ifrit being a melee, he was the most susceptible to die. Titan was a tank, but nowhere near as effective as a tank player, which leaves Garuda. She was a ranged and usually safe. Although you could sustain your pets, Garuda was the lowest maintenance and pretty much the default. With these pets came commands which increased damage output and offered some utility, but activating these commands was a challenge in of itself, because the servers in FF14 aren't exactly the most responsive, and when it comes to a command that tells another entity to do something, it suffers from delay. But that wasn't the only thing. If the pet was in the middle of doing an action, then it'll just forget that you told it to rouse, spur, or enkindle 2 seconds ago. A few other things worth mentioning are the important cross-class actions, Virus and Eye for an Eye. Virus reduced a target's strength and dexterity by 15% and intelligence and mind by 15% through the Super Virus trait at level 28. So only Summoners and Scholars had the extra int and mind down effect, while Black Mage and White Mage only had the strength and dexterity down part of it. Eye for an Eye was an interesting one, as you could apply this to a party member, and every time they received an attack, there was a 20% chance the attacker would deal 10% less damage for the next 20 seconds. Not 100% reliable, but it was pretty cool nevertheless. To say the least, Summoner was awkward with its pets, and changing them was honestly for the best. It's just kind of a shame about the dot-based gameplay being a thing no more. Tanks have changed a lot since the days of A Realm Reborn. One of the most significant being tank stances, and there only being 2 tanks, Paladin and Warrior, which made balancing the 2 a lot easier than the 4 we have today. Still, they somehow managed to up on that font until patch 2.1, which we'll get into. But we'll start with Paladin, and their tank stance in A Realm Reborn was Shield Oath. This reduced damage taken by 20% and damage dealt by 15% while increasing enmity gain. This was on the GCD, by the way, which made it fairly clunky to activate and also for some reason wasn't unlocked until level 40. Now let's compare that to Iron Will, Endwalker's Paladin tank stance, which simply increases enmity generation, and they added the 20% mitigation to the tank mastery trait. Iron Will is also an OGCD, which makes it a lot easier to use over Shield Oath. A Realm Reborn Paladin also had the addition of a DPS stance, which added an additional 75 potency to their auto attacks. Speaking of auto attacks, in A Realm Reborn, you had to be facing your targets for auto attacks to actually execute, otherwise they would just be skipped. Now you can get away with looking away and autos still go through. Just like with Shield Oath, Sword Oath was also on the GCD, so swapping between Shield Oath and Sword Oath required an entire GCD window. Tanks in A Realm Reborn also had enmity combos. For Paladin, this was Fast Blade into Savage Blade into Rage of Halone, while Warriors was Heavy Swing into Skull Sunder into Butcher's Block. Warriors was just pure damage plus enmity gain, while Paladin's Rage of Halone actually applied a debuff which reduced a target's strength by 10% for 20 seconds. And then Paladin also had the totally bizarre half-finish combo which was Fast Blade into Riot Blade, and that was it. There was no third hit, which funnily enough did actually see use due to its MP regen and lack of enmity generation, so a Paladin could safely use this combo and not steal aggro off the other tank, but they still wanted to use the enmity combo even as an off tank to of course deal more damage, but also keep the Rage of Halone debuff up, so it was a mix of the 2 combos here. Paladins also needed MP for Flash, which just increased enmity generation in an AoE around the Paladin on the GCD and dealt no damage, which meant the only AoE damage Paladin had was Circle of Scorn, which, as you can imagine, felt pretty bad. Thankfully in Endwalker, Paladin actually has an AoE combo. A few other changes worth noting are some of Paladin's OGCDs, like Rampart not being a crossrail action and being exclusive to Paladin, Sentinel reducing 40% damage but only lasting 10 seconds and being on a 180 second cooldown, Spirits Within damage scaled off your current HP, so the higher HP you had, the more damage it dealt, and it also silenced the target. Bulwark increased block rate by 60% for 15 seconds on a 180 second cooldown, Cover only working on physical attacks and had a small range of 6 yalms, and Hallowed Ground hasn't seen a single change and still has that same dog activation time it's had since the A Realm Reborn era. Please fix this, Square Enix. Compare that to Endwalker, and we have Rampart as a crossrail action, Sentinel reducing 30% damage but lasting 15 seconds and on a 120 second cooldown, Spirits Within is just a damaging OGCD, and Bulwark is actually good. Then there's a few things that are removed, like Convalescence, which increased HP restored by 20% for 20 seconds, Awareness, which reduced chance of suffering critical hits by 25%, and yes, enemies could crit you in A Realm Reborn, and that wasn't changed until Shadowbringers. Tempered Will, which cured binds and heavies, and made the Paladin knockback immune for 10 seconds, which meant at the time, Paladin was actually the only job with a knockback immune. And Shield Swipe, which was a GCD attack that could only be used after blocking an attack, and this would pacify the target if they could be. It was also TP and damage efficient. So yeah, Paladin was significantly different to how it plays now in Endwalker, because it didn't have its magic combo. All it did have was 2 combos, and one of them was unfinished. So yeah, that was pretty fun. Warriors in A Realm Reborn had the tank stance Defiance, and although the name remains the same from A Realm Reborn to Endwalker, they were different. Defiance in A Realm Reborn increased maximum HP by 25%, reduced damage dealt by 20%, and increased enmity. Compared to Paladin, Defiance was unlocked much earlier at level 30, and is an OGCD, so Warrior didn't have to deal with the clunkiness of Shield Oath. They also had an ability called Unchained, which nullified the damage penalty of Defiance, which was pretty neat. While in Defiance, Warrior also built up Wrath stacks and collected 1 for each second or third hit in their combo, and could hold up to 5 stacks. Each stack increased healing received, and once 5 stacks have been reached, the warrior could spend it on an inner beast, a single target attack which restored 300% HP of the damage done, or Steel Cyclone, which was an AoE attack, both of which ignored the damage penalty of Defiance. Warrior's AoE attack was Overpower, which was a cone in front of them and had an extremely slow animation. If you see an NPC use this ability, that was the same Overpower we had in 2.0. Thankfully though, Warrior had access to Paladin cross-class actions, not only boosting their survivability with Convalescence and Awareness, but also gave them access to Flash, which costed MP, but no TP. Ideally, you didn't want to use this over Overpower, but it was nice if you ran out of TP or just needed the snap aggro from Flash, as it was a faster animation. For some reason, Savage Blade was also a cross-class action, the second hit to Paladin's enmity combo. I have no idea what they were thinking with this, considering as a warrior you had your own enmity combo, but it was there. Now, it may come as a surprise, considering Warrior's current state in Endwalker, Warrior in 2.0 was actually pretty unplayable in high-end content until patch 2.1, due to a severe lack of mitigation and utility. This meant that groups preferred 2 paladins over a paladin and a warrior, which is not something you'd see today. The only defensive options Warrior had was Thriller Battle, Foresight, and Bloodbath. Thriller Battle increased HP by 20% for 10 seconds, Foresight increased defense by 20% for 20 seconds, and Bloodbath converted 25% of your weapon skill's damage dealt into HP. And honestly, I find it kind of funny that Bloodbath is now a role action and no longer belongs to Warrior, but I guess Blood Wedding makes up for that. Anyway, as you can probably gather, Warrior's defensive options were pretty bad at the time. Vengeance also existed, but only had the retaliation effect, and Rampart wasn't a cross-class skill yet. They also didn't even have an invulnerability. Holmgang simply bound you and your target within 3 arms, and that was it. Then patch 2.1 came around and made some pretty significant changes to Warrior. Defiance had an added effect of 20% more HP received from healing effects, while removing the increased healing received from Wrath stacks, making it more consistent. Vengeance now reduced 30% damage taken for 15 seconds every 120 seconds. Thriller Battle was extended to 20 seconds, and Inner Beast was changed from restoring 300% of the HP done to 100%, but reduced damage taken by 20% for 6 seconds. Storm's Path, one of Warrior's combo finishers, also had an added effect of reducing the target's damage done by 10%, and that was a pretty wild debuff which Warriors would mostly keep up at all times, or at least apply it when necessary, like for a tank buster and raid wides. Overpower's animation was also significantly sped up, and finally, when Holmgang was active, your HP couldn't be reduced past 1. The range was extended to 6 yards, and it would pull the target to you for 6 seconds on a 180 second cooldown. Comparing that all to Endwalker's Warrior, Defiance simply increases enmity, Vengeance remains the same, Thriller Battle is only 10 seconds now, Inner Beast is simply a gauge spender for damage pre-level 50, Storm's Path is mostly just a gauge builder, Overpower is a circle area around the Warrior, and Holmgang lasts 10 seconds now on a 240 second cooldown, and the bind was removed. We may as well talk about some of the remaining abilities that were either changed or removed too, which include Maim, Storm's Eye, Berserk, Fracture, and Heavy Swing. Main was the second combo hit before Storm's Path or Storm's Eye, and increased damage dealt by 20% for 24 seconds. Storm's Eye reduced the target slashing resistance by 10% for 15 seconds, which in turn increased their own damage, but also the damage of paladins, and saved ninjas from having to use Dancing Edge, effectively increasing their damage too. Berserk, on the other hand, was Warrior's personal damage buff, which increased their attack power by 50% for 20 seconds on a 90-second cooldown, but it did pacify the warrior for 5 seconds once the effect expired, meaning they couldn't do any GCDs for 5 seconds once the effect of Berserk expires. This was pretty awkward when you needed an inner beast for a tank buster, but it gave warrior this kind of risky and rewarding gameplay feel to it. Fracture was just a damage over time effect, and Heavy Swing was warrior's stun. Warriors could also cross-class monk abilities, which gave them access to a few more defensive options like Featherfoot, Second Wind, and Mantra, but most importantly, Internal Release. Now, without the trait upgrade, Internal Release is only 20% increased crit rate for 15 seconds every 1 minute, but that was still pretty neat. Not just for the damage, but also getting a crit in a beast or crits during Bloodbath gave Warrior more self-healing, which actively helped sustain themselves. Now in Endwalker, Berserk is just replaced by Inner Release, Maim is just part of the Path and Eye combo, Storm's Eye increases damage done by 10% for 30 seconds and can be stacked up to 60 seconds, and Fracture and Heavy Swing have been removed, but Warrior can still stun targets thanks to Low Blow, and cross-class actions are no more. All of this made a really interesting dynamic between Paladins and Warriors, with Warriors being the main tank and Paladins being the off-tank. The reason for this is because Paladins had a DPS stance, which Warriors at the time lacked, while Warriors didn't lose as much damage from being in Defiance as opposed to a Paladin being in Shield Oath, because of Unchained and Inner Beast ignoring the damage penalty. In addition to just being an extremely durable tank with how strong Inner Beast was, how quick Holmgang was to come off cooldown, and just how potent Vengeance was as opposed to Sentinel. That said, during that era, we as a player base weren't as good at the game as we are now, and didn't really care about the most optimal DPS format, so you would still get off-tank warriors and main-tank paladins. However, when we did start caring about our DPS, warriors were actually less effective as a main tank over a paladin because we didn't actually want to have our tank stances active when tanking so we could increase our overall damage output, and a paladin in Sword Oath was more durable than a warrior not in Defiance, as warriors only built Wrath while in Defiance, and no Wrath meant no Inner Beast, which meant quite the lack of durability. This, however, resulted in another issue: enmity problems. You couldn't just pull a boss not in tank stance and expect to keep aggro from DPS blasting. A good solution to this was a warrior pulling in Defiance, activating Unchained and bursting with Berserk, and once the Unchained buff ran out, the warrior could drop Defiance and then the paladin could provoke the boss and maintain aggro. Provoke wasn't nearly as potent as it is now though, and there was no Shirk. So when tank swapping, the tank provoking had to be ready to follow up the provoke with an enmity combo, while the other tank had to make sure not to be using an enmity combo at the time. Provoke was also a paladin cross-class skill, so warrior needed to level paladin to 22 to actually do their job as a tank. To add to this, in a Realm Reborn, accessories weren't role restricted, and they only had one main stat and 2 substats. So melees had strength plus 2 substats, while tank accessories had vitality plus 2 substats. So yeah, if you are a full right side vitality tank, you completely missed out on any potential strength to your right side, which created a divide between tanks who wore vitality accessories and tanks who wore strength accessories. But as time passed on, more and more tanks converted to strength due to no longer being able to ignore the significant DPS increase it provided tanks, and the sooner the boss dies, the better for everyone else. Still, having vitality was handy as some bosses hit hard, and that extra vitality went a long way. The workaround for this was tanks to acquire a full set of crafted strength accessories and meld vitality onto them, so they could have the best of both worlds. These accessories were 20 item levels lower than the highest item level accessories, and were a real pain in the ass to make thanks to overmeld chances being so low, and every time you wanted to try a remeld, you had to navigate through the window over and over again, unlike now where you can just bulk meld materia. Still, the trade-off was worth it over having pure vitality or strength, although you could get away with full strength in some encounters if they didn't do that much damage, and if you didn't want to deal with all the overmelding, you could also just mix and match strength and vitality accessories. Thankfully today, all type of accessories have vitality plus their main stat, so no more pure vitality or strength tanks. While on the topic of stats, every class also had 30 stat points they could distribute amongst the main stats, but everyone would just allocate these points into their main stat because why wouldn't you? I mention this now because tanks had the choice between 30 in strength or vitality, or they could evenly allocate them. But most tanks just went 30 strength, which was a pretty significant gain back then. Comparing all that to Endwalker, there really isn't much choice in how you build yourself as a tank, as accessories are now role locked, but include vitality and strength, and the 30 stat points were removed in Stormblood, which is great because this system really sucked if you played both Summoner and Scholar, as you'd have to constantly change your 30 stat points from Intelligence to Mind every time you wanted to switch between the two, and to do this you'd have to visit your Grand Company and purchase the Keeper of Him for 10,000 Grand Company seals. Tanks also had the parry stat, which was pretty much a trap stat, as all it did was increase your parry rate by a marginal amount and just wasn't worth over having more crit, det, or even skill speed. Also, as I mentioned earlier, you couldn't and still can't parry magic, and with that said, paladins at the time also couldn't block magic until Stormblood. Parry was replaced by the stat Tenacity in Stormblood, which is still not great, but a lot better than whatever the they were doing with parry. While we're here, we may as well mention crit as well. Back in Realm Reborn, all crit did was raise your crit rate, which arguably made the stat a lot more balanced than what it is in Endwalker, increasing both crit rate and damage. And before I forget, accuracy was also a stat. Back in Realm Reborn, enemies, which include raid bosses, had a chance to dodge attacks if your accuracy didn't meet the threshold. These thresholds varied from the front, flank, and rear, with front needing the most accuracy and rear needing the least. This meant that tanks needed the highest accuracy threshold, while melees in theory only needed the flank threshold, but some encounters made it difficult to consistently hit your flank and rear attacks, meaning sometimes even melees would need the front accuracy. Meanwhile, range attacks only required the lowest accuracy threshold due to range attacks being their own position in a way. So, as a random example, let's say a boss required 900 of the accuracy stat to hit the front, 850 for the flank, and 800 for the rear. This would mean tanks would need 900 accuracy, melees 850 to 900 depending on encounter design, and range only 800. To add to this, every encounter required different levels of accuracy, with higher tiered content requiring the most. This meant that the first floor of a raid required less accuracy than the final floor, and vice versa. So if you really wanted to, you could switch your gear sets per floor to really min-max your stats. Then Stormblood came around, removed accuracy, and replaced it with direct hit. Direct hit has its own problems, but it's definitely more accessible than requiring accuracy. Healers, just like tanks, have seen some pretty significant changes since Realm Reborn, most notably their damage spells scaling with intelligence, and their MP management, which we briefly touched up on already. So, how did healers DPS when their damage scaled with intelligence? All their gear also had mind, but they did have a workaround. A little ability called Cleric Stance, a white mage ability that Scholar could cross-class. Cleric Stance swapped your current mind and intelligence around, increased the potency of damaging spells by 10%, and reduced the potency of healing spells by 20%, and had a recast of 5 seconds. That felt like an eternity, especially if you used it at a really bad moment when your healing is needed most. Basically, if you wanted to do damage as a healer, you had to be in Cleric Stance. If you wanted to heal, you had to have it disabled. And that's what we called stance dancing, as healers would dance between Cleric Stance and no Cleric Stance. And that's all well and good, but a lot of healers didn't actually do damage, and the ones that did were pretty rare. It wasn't until Heaven's Ward where people started to expect healers to actually do damage. Compare that to Endwalker, and it's a lot easier to do damage and heal, due to mind scaling with healers' damage, and now it's totally expected for every healer to actively be contributing towards the party's damage. But what about the healers themselves? In Realm Reborn, there were only 2 healers, White Mage, the pure healer, and Scholar, the barrier healer, as opposed to the 4 we have in Endwalker. Just like with tanks, this made it extremely easy to bounce around, because there was only 2. White Mage in Realm Reborn has seen some changes up to Endwalker, but something that has always remained the same is its ease of use and ability to output massive heals to restore its party's health to full, and it's only got easier and more accessible as time went by. Some standout things include Protect, Stone Skin, and Divine Seal. Protect increased physical defense to all nearby party members and lasted 30 minutes, which means you'd use this before pulling an encounter and was pretty much a necessity if you wanted to survive raid-wide mechanics comfortably. It also increased magical defense at level 16 thanks to the Pro Shell trait. If someone were to die and be resurrected, they would lose the Protect buff and would need it reapplied as soon as possible. This was also cross-classable, so Scholar and Paladins had access to it as well, but for the most part, only a White Mage would want to apply it due to the cross-class abilities lacking trait upgrades. Raise was also interestingly enough a cross-class ability. I mentioned this because Paladins could raise, but not in combat. That was exclusive to White Mages, Scholars, and Summoners due to the trait upgrade that allows raising in combat, but still a fun little interaction nevertheless. Stone Skin simply created a barrier around the target that absorbs physical damage totaling 10% of the target's HP, and being further upgraded at level 36 to 18%. Although White Mage lacked any mitigation or shielding, it did have this spell handy, which was nice for squishies. Just like with Protect, it was also a cross-class ability. And then there was Divine Seal, which increased Cure magic potency by 30% for 15 seconds on a 60-second cooldown, which was handy for burst healing. I mention these three abilities because they should highlight the most significant changes. Protect was simply removed because it didn't really add any value in terms of gameplay mechanics except for being an extra unnecessary step. Stone Skin was pretty much replaced by Divine Benison in the form of an OGCD on a 30-second cooldown and holds 2 charges, which makes it overall a lot easier to apply. Just like Stone Skin, Divine Seal was also more or less replaced by the ability you know of today as Temperance. Sure, it has 10% less healing potency and an entire extra minute cooldown, but it does have an extra 5-second duration and 10% damage reduction, which makes it a lot more applicable to a wider variety of damage instances. In addition to this, a Realm Reborn White Mage didn't have Afflatus Solace or Rapture, which meant its only healing tools were the base spells like Regen, Cure 1, 2, and 3, and Medical 1 and 2. And yes, the useless trait Free Cure was also a thing, but listen, it actually wasn't that bad back then in a Realm Reborn, as MP management was vastly different to how it is now. Cure 2 also had a 50% chance that the next Cure 3 would be critical. Also, Cure 3 was nowhere near as large as it is now either. And all of these spells are pretty much never used by a Endwalker White Mage, except in a few rare cases, due to Afflatus, Rapture, and Solace. White Mage also had a complete lack of OGCD heals and utility. No Asylum, Assize, Tetragrammaton, Aquaveil, Confession, or Lilibells. It did have Benediction and Presence of Mind low, which pretty much remained the same except Presence of Mind used to increase the spell speed stat and had a lengthy 300-second cooldown compared to Endwalker where it simply reduced cast and recast time on a 120-second cooldown. It also had some other fun things to make its gameplay a little more interesting, like 2 dots to keep track of, Arrow 1 and 2, Holy doing 240 potency compared to the now 150, Repose, which works exactly the same as it does now, just it was a White Mage exclusive ability, Fluid Aura, which was a damaging OGCD with a knockback and bound effect. Most bosses were resistant to the knockback and bind, but it was extra potency on the OGCD. White Mage also had access to both Stone 1 and 2 for no actual reason, other than abilities didn't upgrade themselves in a Realm Reborn, so if you had an upgraded ability, the old version was still in your toolkit. Scholar in a Realm Reborn has changed pretty significantly because they didn't really have much. Like Summoner, its damage rotation was pretty much the same with the exception of not having Fester, but it still had Bio 1 and 2, Miasma 1 and 2, and Shadowflare, and could cross-class Thunder and Arrow for an extra dot. It also had the jank of dealing with pets and their commands, just like Summoner. Interestingly enough, Eos and Selene, Scholar's fairies, were vastly different. Eos was the more healing pet, with regens, burst healing, and some mitigation, while Selene had cleanses and enhancements, like increasing the party's spell and skill speed. But yeah, Scholar just shared a lot of its kit with Summoner due to them both being Arcanists, so they all shared the same traits and base abilities, which they still both are Arcanists, but in Endwalker, their kits are just vastly different and they actually have unique traits. As for their personal kit, Scholar in a Realm Reborn only had 5 extra abilities, not counting the pets: Adloquium, Succor, Leeches, Sacred Soil, and Lustrate. Adloquium, Succor, and Sacred Soil have probably undergone the least number of changes since Endwalker, although Sacred Soil now has a regen effect and is much bigger than what it used to be, but no longer has the 20% chance for a free Succor, so nothing of value was really lost here. Lustrate, however, used to restore a flat 20% of a target's maximum HP, which meant it could be used in Cleric stance and could also bypass any healing down debuffs or mechanics. Compare that to Endwalker's Lustrate, which heals for 600 Cure potency, and you can see why this was a much needed change. Not only because the exploitation this ability used to have, but also healing a flat 20% of a target's HP was kind of broken. As for Leeches, this was just Scholar's cleanse effect. This was a time before Asuna was made a cross-roll action and instead was just a White Mage exclusive ability, so Leeches served as Scholar's way to cleanse any debuffs. Although the combat has remained the same and hasn't seen a complete overhaul like from 1.0 to A Realm Reborn, a lot of systems, features, and mechanics have seen significant updates to change up how the combat of the game feels. Like the removal of TP, stance dancing for tanks and healers, and cross-class actions in exchange for role actions. Changes to MP and MP recovery options, changes to stats like piety, parry, crit, and accuracy, and some buffs being stacks rather than timers. No more resistance down debuffs, which made having a warrior and dragoon almost essential, added job gauges as a resource, and much more that has redefined and shaped the game we know of today. Well, that was a lot, and that's just how the combat was. I haven't even talked about the other things yet. So, we're going to talk about the other things in the best way I can, by telling a story. I first discovered Final Fantasy XIV in my mid-teens as a college student, playing Guild Wars 2 in my free time. And it was good. I played before any expansion or raid content, and all we had at the time were fractals, but that wasn't enough to keep me interested. I had a longing for something more. An MMORPG with a more defined end game. And I see Final Fantasy A Realm Reborn advertised everywhere, and I think, hold up, isn't that really bad MMO? So I look more into it and see it's been relaunched, new and improved. Maybe it has some endgame that can keep me sated and I can grow as a player. And then I saw Catgirls. I was instantly sold. After all, what's the worst that can happen? And that's where it all began. This is what the launcher used to look like, by the way. It's seen some changes over the years, and this is of really no consequence, but I thought it would be fun to point out while we're here. So with the game installed, I made my character. Sadly, in A Realm Reborn, Aura didn't exist, so I guess Catgirls will do for now. Still, they definitely expanded the character creator from 1.0, because there's quite a few options to pick from to make your character your own. It wasn't perfect, but there is enough there. I pick a server, and all the EU servers at the time were full, and I didn't realize you had to wait for the servers to be less congested before making a character. So I went ahead and made my character on the NA server, Siren. Although the Chaos Data Center was the designated EU cluster, it didn't make a difference on ping until Heavensward, as all the NA and EU servers were located in Canada and Montreal. Anyway, I picked my class and Lancer seemed the most appealing to me, as it later becomes Dragoon, and who doesn't think Dragoon looks cool as With my character made, I set out on my journey to see what this game is about. I did zero prior research, but even at such a young age, I just loved MMOs, be it action, tab targeting, or turn-based. I'm welcomed by a few cutscenes and then arrive in New Gridania, and this whole premise hasn't really changed much over the years. The initial class you pick dictates which city-state you arrive in. The first thing I noticed, however, is just how good the game looked and how well it ran on my PC, which was an old-ass computer. They took the performance issues of 1.0 extremely seriously and really optimized the game even for lower-end builds. Something that didn't look good though was that default UI, but it completely took me by surprise with just how customizable this is compared to other MMOs like WoW and Guild Wars 2. The UI has mostly remained the same since A Realm Reborn, but it has seen some pretty significant quality of life additions like cooldown timers separating elements from the target bar, showing percentages, and much more. And that's just the UI. The game itself has seen a ton of quality of life updates to improve accessibility and convenience. Something that might be standard to you, like cooldown tree setting after a wipe, simply wasn't a thing during A Realm Reborn. We had to physically wait for everyone's cooldowns to come back up before pulling an encounter again, or just pull with what we have and adjust our cooldown rotation, because in prog, waiting for something like Hallowed Ground to come back up can really take its toll on everyone's time. So yeah, that sucked. But hey, we didn't know any better, and this was a time before things like FF logs or plugins, so we just got on with it. Where were we again? Oh right, I was telling my story. Well, I think it's worth talking about what makes A Realm Reborn such a slog. And it's all thanks to the story, which has seen multiple adjustments throughout the years in an effort to condense it down. There's a reason A Realm Reborn is considered a slog even to today's standards with all the changes, because it's so unnecessarily long. And at the time, it had to be. Level 1 to 50 was all we had. So it had to last you, and there was no rush either. Everyone was new, and there was no expansions to catch up to, and the endgame content wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. Now, I'm no story expert, and I don't want to make it a focus of this video, because I'm sure there's a lot more qualified people out there to talk about the story and the lore, but I will say that I did actually enjoy the story of A Realm Reborn a lot, even in its original unfiltered state. It's a story of an adventurer who starts with nothing but a humble beginning, and continues to soar new heights until realizing they are, wow, the Warrior of Light. and it's just kind of cool, even though at the time it was all we had and we didn't have to deal with a constant reminder of it gets better once you reach Heaven's Ward, because we didn't have that and had to appreciate the Realm Reborn story for what it was, a prologue of the Warrior Light story. As for the journey of that story, well, leveling took some time. The MSQ wasn't enough to purely level you either, and would level barrier you, so we had to level through dungeons and fates. And queuing for a dungeon as a DPS wasn't a great experience either, with wait times of up to 30 minutes plus. The game wasn't nearly as active as it is now, and the duty support system was yet to be implemented, so you had a choice: spam fates or queue dungeons. You could also spam fates and queue dungeons, but you wouldn't be able to join a party, making it more difficult to get max rewards, and anything below gold contribution kind of sucks. At least the fate zones were active, and it got people talking with each other as they shared the pain of that slow grind. I remember players actually congratulating each other for every level up. It was quite wholesome. And then there was, of course, the dungeons, which have changed significantly since The Realm Reborn, and that's mainly thanks to the dungeon overhauls which happened throughout Endwalker to make them more in line with modern dungeon design and be compatible with the duty support system. Not every dungeon has been changed, but the ones that have are worth going over, so let's go over them before the changes. Most of these dungeons have seen slight touch-ups like improved lighting and slight architecture changes, but Copperbell Mines is the first dungeon where real change has been made. Around Reborn's Copperbell Mines pathing remains mostly the same, with the same old jank mobs that unaggro after a certain distance. The real change here are the objective-based items you find along the way. Fire Sand, which is used to progress the dungeon. These used to be scattered throughout the dungeon, but now you'll find enough to progress either on the linear path or next to the fuses that clear the way. Another major thing that was changed were all three of the bosses. The first boss was a big open room with just a single Spriggan. The moment you pulled the Spriggan, the encounter begun, and it was bad. More Spriggans would slowly spawn, the occasional bomb, and after a while a giant named Kotos would jump down and serve as the actual boss. And he really did nothing, and just felt like another mob rather than an actual boss fight. And if you enjoyed all that waiting on the first boss, you would have loved the second boss, Icarus Aya, because all you did here was wait around and press a button, spawn a bomb, wait for the bomb to explode the boss into 2, wait around, press the button, spawn a bomb, wait for the bomb to explode, splitting the boss into 4, press a button, spawn a bomb, wait for the bomb to explode until finally the boss is split into 8, and then AoE down all the slimes if you had an AoE at that level. Thankfully, the last boss had no more waiting, but just like the first boss, he really did nothing special. His only mechanic was he would attempt to break these walls down with adds behind them. Once broken, the adds would move on to the second wall to break, and once both walls are broken, the adds would collapse onto the group. But most groups simply ignored this mechanic and just burned the boss down before the second wall even broke. Compare all that to Endwalker's Copperbell Mines, and you have a completely different experience. The bosses aren't actually miserable anymore, and feel like actual bosses with actual mechanics. The next dungeon that has seen significant changes would have to be Totorak, but for the opposite reasons of Copperbell Mines, which saw overhauled bosses. While Totorak bosses remain mostly the same, it saw more of an overhaul to its pathing. This dungeon used to be one hell of a labyrinth, with multiple different paths with the objective of finding these items called photocells to progress the dungeon. Throughout the dungeon, you'd also find obstacles that would slow you down, like corridors that would drag you through and block themselves off with web walls that you could destroy if any other players lagged behind, slime puddles that would slow you down, and fleshy pods that explode when you got too close or destroyed them. Then Endwalker came along and turned this once maze-like dungeon into a more linear experience. Admittedly, it's lost a lot of its charm, but in exchange for that, it does look much better, and it's a lot more sprout-friendly than the old iteration. Then there's Hawkeye Manor, which hasn't seen changes until defeating the second boss. Here you had two choices: run all the way back to the start of the dungeon, or use Return, because there was no portal like there is now in Endwalker. Of course, most players opted in to use Return. Then there's the last boss, Lady Amadine, which is completely different to how it is in Endwalker. In each corner of the arena, there were these lamps which pulsed for AoE damage but could be deactivated, but would eventually reactivate, so the group had to somewhat coordinate who takes what lamp to deactivate. Bombs also spawned, and later two succubus adds who do additional AoE damage, and an Araham who stone skins the boss, all of which had to be taken care of, but you could ignore the 2 Succubus and Araham if your DPS was good enough. All of this happened while the lamps continued to reactivate, so things got extremely hectic. The tank would be busy picking up all the ads, the healer trying to keep everyone alive, and the DPS scurrying to deactivate the lamps and DPS down the boss or the ads, which was quite an overwhelming experience for a level 28 boss fight. Now this boss fight has been completely overhauled. No more lamps, and the ads spawn to do their mechanics, and that's about it. Similar to Hawkeye Manor, Brayflock's Longstop only saw little changes to its structure. Between the second and third boss, there were these optional paths you could take to clear more mobs and get more loot, but these have since been removed. A big change, however, was Aetir, the final boss, which used to spit these poison AoEs at random players that left a lingering puddle, and if the boss stood in these puddles, it would regen its HP, so the tank had to make sure that the boss was out of these puddles. It was nothing crazy like the Hawkeye Manor final boss, but it did mean the tank had to keep on top of positioning. And finally, we have Stone Vigil, the last pre-level 50 dungeon with significant changes made to it. The second boss in A Realm Reborn had a dragon outside the arena that would harass the group with AoE damage until one of the 3 cannons which pointed at the dragon were interacted with to temporarily disable it. Tornadoes would also spawn similar to how they spawn in the current iteration, but this did make it awkward to use the cannons if they overlap. The final boss was also changed, but only ever so slightly. These AoE puddles that he did during the dive bombs would linger, which made the arena really messy if not placed properly, which would make dodging the dive bombs a lot more awkward. Now these AoE puddles no longer linger, making it a lot easier overall. And that was all the pre-level 50 dungeons that saw significant changes. So once we passed those and reached level 50, we were just about ready for Endgame. But before entering Endgame, there was one more trial, Cape Westwind. This was the first mandatory 8-player duty, but the fight itself was simple enough. Tank boss, dodge AoEs, pick up trash, kill boss, GGEs. It's since been turned into a solo-only instance during the A Realm Reborn main scenario thanks to patch 6.1. After that, we're finally ready to do level 50 dungeons, and this is where the real endgame begun, the gear grind. Level 50 dungeons started to cough up Allagan tomestones of philosophy and mythology, which were used to buy gear at Mordona, the endgame hub of Realm Reborn. Philosophy were used to buy Darklight armor and accessories, and grinding a full set of Darklight gear was no easy feat with how time-consuming dungeons were, how little tomes they gave out, and a complete lack of duty roulettes. That didn't come until patch 2.1. So yeah, tomes at first sucked to get, and when you saw someone in a full Darklight set, you know they grinded hard for it. Mythology, on the other hand, were the weekly capped tomes and were used to buy upgraded artifact armor, and yes, that meant whatever you spent your weekly tomes on was locked to a single job, rather than a role, which severely limited what job you could play in higher end content. These tomestones were also capped at 300 a week. Accessories and belts cost 375, head, hands and feet cost 495, and body and legs cost 825. So if you wanted any piece of gear, you'd have to wait 2 to 3 weeks with hardly any leftover tomes. The idea was that players would take months to gear up by collecting weekly mythology tome gear alongside the gear you got from clearing the raid turns weekly in the Binding Coil of Bahamut. Then patch 2.1 came around and changed the weekly tome cap from 300 to 450. And while on the topic of gear, you may have noticed I mentioned belts. Those have since been removed with the launch of Endwalker, as they were just gear blow and weren't actually visible pieces of gear. While talking about gear, the place you got all your gear, Mordona, actually saw developments over the patch cycle of A Realm Reborn. It started out as a humble encampment and turned into the fortress we see today. This trend continued into Heavensward with Idleshire, but stopped at Stormblood, which is kind of sad because it was cute seeing these settlements develop over the course of the expansions. Anyway, the first 2 level 50 dungeons that gave out tomestones were Castrum Meridum and Praetorium, and have seen some of the most significant changes throughout the years. These 4-player streamlined dungeons used to be 8-player instances with a lot of trash and bosses to make them feel like a mini raid of sorts. Castrum had multiple objectives and interactions which have been completely removed from the current iteration, like taking a diverted path to blow up some cerulean pumps, disabling spotlights, using cannons to clear trash faster, and destroying field generators until you reach the end boss Livia, which sucked because all you did here was keep aggro on Livia, kill ads, load and fire cannons to slowly chip away at Livia's HP, and then once you reduced her HP to 0, she would enter her second phase, in which she did nothing special, and that was the same for all bosses up to this point really. Add spawn, kill or ignore ads, and then beat down boss. Praetorium, on the other hand, probably saw less changes, but changes nevertheless. Praetorium had overall more trash than the current iteration, but you could skip a majority of it by running past and interacting with the terminals. The structure was a lot more padded out, with more paths and sections like having to go up an elevator. Boss fights were pretty much of no significance, mechanic-wise, but once you defeat Gaius, you'd proceed to fight the ultimate weapon twice rather than in a separate instance. This fight wasn't anything crazy low, just dodge AoEs and you were pretty much set. Oh, and there was one final fight here with La Habrea, which I almost forgot to mention because it's just so forgettable. He did some AoEs, left some puddles, and existed for about a minute. Both of these dungeons also had a ton of cutscenes, but they could all be skipped. That is until patch 2.1 made these cutscenes unskippable to relieve the pressure on Sprouts having to skip them. Then Endwalker remade these dungeons to accommodate duty support and 4 players, split Praetorium and Ultimate Weapon, and cut some of the unimportant cutscenes out. If you didn't fancy playing with 7 other players to grind your tomes, you had 2 choices, the Wanderer's Palace or Amdabar's Keep. And these dungeons didn't mess around. They were designed to not be cleared on your first or even second attempt. This design philosophy didn't last long though. The Wanderer's Palace hasn't really seen any changes from A Realm Reborn to now, except the fact that players are better and pushing a lot more damage is a lot easier due to stat squish. So if you were to enter Wanderer's Palace today, you wouldn't see half, if any, of the mechanics unless you used minimum item level sync. As you start the dungeon, you'll be stalked by this giant Tomberry who will kill players in 1 to 2 hits and can't be targeted. So your only option is to continue onwards as fast as you can, so it doesn't catch up, which gave it a sort of DPS check. Once the group reaches the boss, it would give up its chase so the party could fight the boss in peace. The mechanics of this boss remain mostly unchanged and are of really no consequence. All it was some dodgeable AoEs and dispels. The next section is where positioning and movement really mattered, as you enter this big room with multiple different paths where once again giant Tombrays stalk the halls. But rather than chasing you, here they patrolled. So the goal was to avoid them while taking down trash, collecting oil, activating the device, and then pressing onwards. The second boss, Giant Bavarius, had a little bit to it, but it was nothing significant. The first mechanic he did spawned some ads, which most groups would just AoE down, and secondly, he would target a player to chase and slap them, which could be lethal if their gear wasn't good. So you could either tank this or kite the boss to avoid the slap. The third section was similar to the first. Once again, you'd have a giant Tomberry stalk you, but this section was a lot shorter. Just a small walk up some stairs and some trash balls, and you'll be already by the final boss, Tomberry King. And this is what made this dungeon really tricky. The king himself didn't really do much, except for a nasty ability called Everybody's Grudge, a tank buster that didn't do much by itself, but the king also spawned Tomberry ads that would progressively make their way to the center and attack anyone close by. You needed to clear out these ads before things got too chaotic, but for every Tomberry killed, the king would get a stack of Rancor that would increase the damage of Everybody's Grudge. The goal here was to kill ads in a controlled manner, usually around 3 to 4, wait for Everybody's Grudge, and then repeat the process until the boss is dead. If you were slow, you'd start seeing Tomberry Stalkers, which was just flat out bad news, and kind of made the boss fight a DPS check at this point. And then there was Amdapor Keep, probably the harder out of the 2 dungeons. Just like with the Wanderer's Palace, the dungeon itself hasn't seen many changes, so if you wanted this experience, you could just sink down and go minimum item level. But it did actually receive some nerfs to make it easier, which we'll get into. The trash itself wasn't too much of an issue, but you had to be alert of the dollar hands patrolling throughout the dungeon. Pull one of these into an ongoing trash group and you're going to have a bad time. They hit hard and ideally were to be avoided or single pulled. Once you've managed to get your group through the Dullahan hell, you'll be at the first boss, the Lunatic Priest, who really wasn't the boss because once you brought his HP down enough, he summoned the Psych Flare, the real boss. Psych Flare's main mechanic was spawning these golem ads, small ones that could be killed, and the giant one that couldn't be targeted, and would just do these massive dodgeable AoEs, which could easily be avoided by just hugging the wall or line of sighting the AoE with the arena's pillars. The second boss, Demon Wall, is where things took a turn for the worst for a lot of groups. His main mechanics were these 2 set of line AoEs that came one after each other, and ideally should be dodged or you'd be taking some damage and receive a slow debuff. Once he did this mechanic twice, he'd cast Repel, which would knock everyone back. If a player was caught off center, they'd be knocked off the arena and die. He also moved with each Repel, serving as a DPS check. After the second set of line AoEs and Repel, the back of the arena would become unsafe and 2 B ads would spawn. These 2 Bs were absolute menaces and filtered a lot of groups from progressing the dungeon. What made these Bs difficult was their point-blank AoE ability Thunderstorm, which overlapped the boss's line AoEs. The Bs could be interrupted, so you might think, why not just stun them? Yeah, well, we were bad, and stuns were tied to potency back then, so expecting that from a player back then was something else. Still, Square Enix did eventually step in and remove the bees entirely from this boss, just so we could consistently clear the dungeon and get our tomes. Just before the third boss, there were these two Dullahan patrols. I actually remember waiting for these just so my group could sneak by them and enter the boss without having to fight them. That's how much we didn't want to deal with Dullahans. The third boss wasn't so bad, with its main mechanic being Eminent Catastrophe, a room-wide AoE from the center of the arena, and had to be avoided by standing behind these gargoyle statues, otherwise you'd die. This didn't really cause issues, but with the removal of Demon Wall's bees, also saw a reduction in damage to Eminent Catastrophe, no longer outright killing players caught by it. And those were all the dungeons we had for a while. So with a full Darklight set farmed and maybe some mythology pieces acquired, what was there to do? Well, if you play Final Fantasy XIV, I'm sure you're aware of the concept of high-end content, and A Realm Reborn was no different. It had trials and raids, but these worked a little differently than what you're probably used to. At launch, the trials only went up to hard difficulty, which meant no extreme trials, at least not yet. But just because there was no extreme trials didn't mean the high-end content was easy. If you wanted your relic, which most players did, you were forced into doing 2 relic-specific trials, Chimera and Hydra, and doing all 3 hard mode trials, Ifrit, Garuda, and Titan. Something worth mentioning is the value of gear in A Realm Reborn was significantly higher than any other expansion. Chimera and Hydra didn't necessarily require higher item level gear, other than the artifact gear you get from reaching level 50, but it definitely made things a lot easier the more gear you had. Both of these trials required a good, coordinated team to tackle, well-timed stuns, silencers and cleanses, DPS who knew how to output damage, healers who could keep on top of the healing, and tanks that could mitigate properly, position the boss, and pick up adds quickly were all important skills to be able to defeat these trials when gear was limited. So yeah, that wasn't easy for the average player, but the average player did feel inclined to do it if they wanted their shiny relic. But even after clearing Chimera and Hydra, there was still the matter of the hard modes, Ifrit, Garuda, and Titan. Ifrit wasn't too bad, but tanks were actually expected to stun the eruptions to make it easier. Killing the nails was pretty simple, but the dashes did tend to catch people off because now instead of just 1, there were 4. Garuda, however, tested team coordination, as the groups had to split up to kill the feather adds, and later deal with Tirada and Supana, killing them in order according to the tethers, green tether first and then the red tethered ad, and then proceeding to burn Garuda down. Titan was the real menace here and filtered a lot of players from getting their relics, and all he really tested was how good can you dodge AoEs, which turns out not a lot of players were good at the time, myself included. And if you fell off the platform here, you'd be permanently dead until either the fight is finished or the party wipes, and the only thing you could watch is your dead body in shame at the bottom of the arena. This is the trial that got me to switch from standard to legacy, because I just couldn't dodge landslides without it. Tackling these during the first few months of A Realm Reborn was tough, but it got much easier over time as people acquired more gear and learnt the game better. As for the raids, we had the Binding Coil of Bahamut, which had no Savage or Normal mode, but that didn't make it any less difficult or the story any less interesting. In fact, if you wanted to experience the story, you had to raid, and it wasn't easy. The raids haven't changed over the years, except that you can queue into these raids from the Duty Finder now, rather than having to physically go to the raid location. And yes, if you wanted to raid during A Realm Reborn, you had to physically go to the location of the raid with 7 other players, all within the same server, all in the same zone together, before entering. There was also no party finder. That didn't come until 2.1. This meant raiding was done with 3 companies, although pugging did exist through Shout Chat, usually done in Mordona or Eastern La Nocia, where the Binding Coil was located. It's also worth mentioning, now, before I forget, that food didn't persist through death, so if you wanted the food buff, you'd have to pop it after every wipe, which honestly, not a lot of people did. Thankfully, this was changed in patch 2.1 to persist through death. Now, compare that to Endwalker's raid scene, which is a lot more accessible with a normal mode for the story enjoyers, a savage difficulty for the raid enjoyers, and just getting into raiding is a lot easier with things such as Crossroad Party Finder, data center travel, cross-region travel, and even Discord communities. Remember, this game came out in 2013, and Discord wasn't a thing until 2015, so we had to use TeamSpeak if we wanted to use voice comms, and you either feel really old right about now, or really young. So, sorry about that. With all that said, there was a positive aspect to a Realm Reborn raiding with how tight-knit it was. If someone was an insufferable asshole, you bet your ass the whole server would probably know about it, which discouraged toxic behavior because your reputation mattered if you wanted to get into high-end content. I'm not claiming there were zero toxic players in a Realm Reborn, but unfortunately compared to Endwalker, it's become a lot easier to be that kind of player and not suffer nearly as many consequences. Still, it's probably better to actually talk about my experience to paint a clearer picture of how raiding really was back then. So I'll continue to tell my story, albeit in a very loose fashion. Before I could even attempt raiding, I needed to go through the process of gearing. So I farmed dungeons for tomes to get myself a full Darklight set, went through all the trials to get myself a relic, learned how to play Dragoon to a degree, and with that, I was ready to raid. Well, kind of. I didn't have an FC at the time, so I had to search shout chats in Maldona and Eastern La Noscea for groups attempting the first floor of the Binding Coil. Eventually I found a first turn progression group looking for a melee, and I took my chance. The first thing we start to do is discuss the strategy, assign roles, and share any information we know about the fight, which I had none of. And yes, you weren't expected to have watched a guide. This was still the early days of the game, and everyone was still trying to learn, so stuff like watching a guide just wasn't expected. Also, while we're here, I just want to point out these attributes at the top of the party list. Strength, Dex, Vitality, Intelligence, Mind, and Piety. These were party bonus stats. Melees added Strengths, Bards added Dexterity, Tanks added Vitality, Casters added Intelligence, and Healers added Mind and Piety. This rewarded well-rounded compositions with party bonuses, which is like how the 1% work right now, except now everyone benefits from an extra 1% stat increase from having one player per role in your party, totaling a 5% bonus in stats. I just thought that was an interesting thing to point out, and what we have now is definitely a lot better, as tanks aren't exactly benefiting from extra intelligence. That said, dexterity did actually increase parry rate in a Realm Reborn, so there was that. Anyway, once everything was ironed out and we had a rough idea of what to do, we'd queue up and attempt the first floor. A few cutscenes play out and we're greeted by our first threat, ADS, a mini-boss before the actual boss. As soon as ADS is pulled, it would start a 4-minute countdown until it starts to cast its Soften Rage, and we had a few mechanics to deal with, like a point-blank AoE and a line AoE. These were pretty trivial by this time though, because to get this far, everyone had most likely done the hard mode trials. Still, that point-blank AoE got me more times than I care to admit, but I'll just blame the ping on that one. But no. The deadliest mechanic here was the high voltage cast ADS did. If this wasn't silenced, it would do a raid-wide damage and paralyze everyone, which pretty much resulted in a wipe. The only 3 jobs with silence at the time were Paladin, Monk, and Bard, and you needed 2 of them to alternate silences. But there wasn't as many jobs back in a Realm Reborn compared to now, so most groups always had a Paladin and a Bard, so this wasn't much of an issue. One last thing this boss did was spawn adds. An attack node which dropped AoEs with heavy effects, and a defense node which did the same point blank AoE the boss does. 3 of these would spawn throughout the encounter and we usually killed except for the last one. We usually left that last one with the off tank and everyone else moved back to the boss to finish it off. Once ADS was defeated, we could progress and make our way to the actual boss. Along the way we had to deal with some trash, but it wasn't anything to write home about. One thing I do miss though is how much this felt like an actual raid with a mini boss at the start and then the trash, and just being able to admire the sights along the way until you reach the end where the real fight begins. You actually got a checkpoint here, so if you had to leave or the timer expired mid-instance, you'd be able to access the checkpoint and skip the mini-boss and the trash, and only one player needed the checkpoint. So if you didn't do ADS in the trash for the week but one player did, they just needed party lead and everyone gets the checkpoint. The actual boss hero was Cassadius, and the first thing you might notice is how untraditional the arena is. It wasn't a circle or a square, it was a bunch of hexagons on various levels and were important to the encounter. The fight itself was relatively simple. Snake does frontal cleave on tank, a baited dodgeable cleave behind, and spits on random players leaving a lingering AoE. Snake also gets hungry, so it gets damage up stacks. Assigned DPS need to stand on a hexagon that is now glowing to spawn a slime. This is why the hexagons are important, by the way. Get slime low, then feed it to Snake. Snake gets some health back, but it also loses the damage up stacks. At around 60-70%, the boss splits into 2, so the off tank grabs one of the snakes and drags it away so they don't reform and enrage. Kill both snakes near the same time and you're done. And That sounds simple, right? Well, I wish, but I went through so many groups just trying to clear this until I realized just how powerless I was as a Dragoon. My only job was to deal damage, and that was literally it. And it made me want a role with a bit more control. I observed the tanks throughout my attempts, and it looked way more interesting with the boss positioning and the responsibility of keeping myself alive. And that's how it began. I leveled up Warrior to 50, geared it up with Dark Light gear, got my relic, and tried again. And within my first try as a Warrior, I got my first ever raid clear and gear drop, the tank chest piece. And yes, for some reason, the loot table was all over the place for the Binding Coil Bahamut, and there was no token system until Heavensward. So you just had to pray that the piece of gear you wanted dropped, and you could win it. With my first raid floor cleared, I was eager for more. So I tried turn 2, which had a really dynamic mechanic to it. Essentially, it's a boss rush, with multiple different routes to take and an enraged timer to keep you moving. The bosses were these Allagan nodes, and you always had to kill 3 to progress to the final boss. Each Allagan node had a special mechanic to it, and once you killed that node, the final boss wouldn't have access to that mechanic. East was the most popular route here, but it didn't really matter because by the time the group got to the last boss, we just waited until the enraged timer had 1 minute left and then pulled. You might wonder why. Well, ADS here has a soft enrage, which meant it didn't flat out kill the group. It just did raid wides for massive damage every few seconds, so you could just heal through these and just burn the boss, eliminating any mechanics the group would have to deal with. Still, that doesn't answer why, so here is the answer. Allagan Rot. A debuff that applies to a random player, lasts 15 seconds, and if it expires, that player will explode, wiping the raid. Thankfully, the rot could be passed from player to player, resetting the timer and granting a rot immunity to the previous rot player for 40 seconds. The idea here was to juggle the Allagan rot between the party until the boss is dead. Pretty simple, right? Well, I feel like this is a reoccurring thing, but during a run Reborn, we were bad. What's even worse is if you didn't want to deal with the Allagan rot on the final boss, you could take a different route, kill the node with the rot, and then not have it for ADS. But that wasn't the popular thing to do, and you know how MMO players are, they're too stubborn to change their ways. Either way, turn 2 didn't personally take me too long to do, considering the enraged cheese trivializing the fight. Turn 3 was something. All you had to do here was get to the end, killing or avoiding trash until one person activated the exit. There was also no loot here, so it really wasn't even considered an encounter. Turn 4 took place on an elevator arena with a lot of adds to the tank. It was basically a big trash fight, but it had enough mechanical execution and strategies you had to form to keep the fight interesting. This was also the encounter that made me realize how bad Warrior was pre-patch 2.1. So I went back and leveled Paladin all the way to 50, got my relic for a third time, and then headed back in and got my clear. And then there was Turn 5's Twintania, the hardest encounter available to players at the time, and for good reason. This was the first fight that did what it did. It was a long encounter with multiple phases, introducing new mechanics along the way. Phase 1 had Twintania stacked with a bunch of adds that needed to be taken care of due to the annoying fireballs that lingered on the ground. Twintania herself used Plummet, a heavy hitting cleave, and Death Sentence, a tank buster that inflicted a healing down debuff on the tank. Phase 2 introduced conflagrations and light party stacks. Phase 3 had the group stack in a ditch and move in and out between dive bombs. Then snake adds spawned, which you needed to burn down. Then Twintania did more dive bombs and spawned more snake adds. Then she would come down for phase 4. Everyone needs to make sure they're in a Neural Link with the main tank being separated in another Neural Link, and she'd use her ultimate ability, which would kill anyone not in a Neural Link. During this phase, she also casted Twisters that would instantly kill any players caught by them, and spawn a Dread Knight in the center of the arena that needed to be stun locked and killed, otherwise it would kill a random player. Final phase, she spawns Hatches, which the off-tank just AFK'd in a Neural Link to soak them, and she also spammed 5 Liquid Hells at a random player. And that's just me simplifying the shit out of the fight. This fight was such a struggle that some groups even exploited a bug where Twintania would stop responding and just AFK. But any players who did this exploit were swiftly banned, and we've never seen an encounter bug this hard since. I also didn't clear this fight until 2.1 came around and buffed Warrior. Then I took up Warrior again and soon after got the clear, because Paladin, right? Funnily enough, this fight could also be solo tanked. In fact, a lot of fights could be during this era, but Turn 5 was especially a popular one for solo tanking. Turn 5 World First was claimed by the Free Company Order of the Blue Garter on the Excalibur server on October the 27th, 2013. Originally an FF11 based community turned FF14 Free Company. With all that said, that was the vanilla Final Fantasy XIV experience. A lot here to keep us busy, especially because we were still trying to improve as a player base and had a long way to go. But we're not only talking about the vanilla experience. The patches throughout A Realm Reborn were equally important. December the 14th, 2013 saw the release of A Realm Reborn's first major update, Patch 2.1, A Realm Awoken. With it came a plethora of changes and additions like various job adjustments, duty roulettes, party finder, the weekly tome gap increasing from 300 to 450, the introduction of the esthetician, the penalty for leaving a duty being increased from 15 to 30 minutes, an inactive auto kick timer in instances, and new content, like A Realm Reborn's first Alliance raid, the introduction of extreme difficulty, more main scenario quests accompanied by a new trial, Beast Tribe quests, the Sylph and the Amagel, and Hildebrand quests, 3 new dungeons, player versus player, treasure hunts, and free company housing. As you can tell, Patch 2.1 was a huge update and set the very foundations for which allows the game to thrive today. Still, it's probably worth talking about these things to give you an idea of how we experienced all of this for the first time. The content 2.1 introduced hasn't really changed a whole lot, but there's some interesting stories to be had. The Labyrinth of the Ancients was the first installment of the now infamous Crystal Tower raid series, and each party within the Alliance had 2 tanks, 2 healers, and 4 DPS. So yeah, this raid used to have 6 tanks running around, which was pretty hectic, but was changed in a smaller patch to 1 tank, 2 healers, and 5 DPS per party. If you were to go into Labyrinth of the Ancients today, you could probably just ignore the majority of the mechanics, but back in A Realm Reborn, we couldn't do that. But they weren't exactly rocket science either. For instance, the Bone Dragon skeletons needed to be tanked as far away as possible from the dragon, because if multiple tethered each other and reached the dragon, the damage would swiftly kill the entire raid. Unlike now, where they can pretty much be ignored and shielded and healed through. Atmos and Thanatos are just as dog in A Realm Reborn as they are now, and if you're in Group C, it's even worse because you probably won't even get a turn to hit the boss. The bombs during the Vazagos needed to be killed, otherwise they'd wipe the raid. King Behemoth's energy towers actually needed to be interacted with, otherwise they'd explode and deal massive raid-wide damage, which isn't something you wanted to deal with. And Archeron, or as you may know of him as Phlegathon. And there's a whole story about his name, but basically, in Japanese, he's called Titan, but it's spelled differently to the Summon Titan. But that doesn't work so well for English, so instead they named him Archeron, which was the same name as an enemy from Final Fantasy III with a similar design, so it worked out. Until patch 2.3 came along and added Cycrus Tower, and had a mob called Archeron. So they had to rename him again, and this time to Phlegathon, which you know of him as today. And yeah, apart from not killing the hands in 2 seconds, and being able to skip the last Ancient Flare, not much has changed from this fight. Patch 2.1 not only introduced the first Alliance raid, but was also the first installment of Extreme Trials, a difficulty intended to ease players into harder content and provide gear rewards to help them tackle high-end encounters. And the difficulty was really good. It wasn't as hard as Twintania, but it was good enough to be a stepping stone for players who wanted to improve and get into raiding. The Ultimate Weapon Extreme was one of the first extremes most of us tackled. It had the lowest item level, and it was probably the easiest of the 3, so it seemed like the obvious choice. You don't get the authentic experience anymore, but the fight was just a lot of dodging, tanks had to swap every few stacks, party had to soak these orbs on Etheric Boom, and tank LB3 the last set. And that was pretty much it. Upon defeat, Ultima dropped item level 80 rings and necklaces. Ifrit, Garuda, and Titan upped the ante in terms of difficulty. Garuda required strict coordination, Titan placed more bombs and does more landslides, and Ifrit required healers to position themselves correctly, forced tank swaps on the tanks, and taught DPS trigger discipline due to nails giving vulnerability stacks for a few seconds after destroying them. For me personally, these encounters were the first time I felt really challenged and forced me to improve myself as a player to clear these fights, as they required a lot from tanks. Garuda has the tanks juggle ads between one another, Titan has the tanks swapping and picking up ads and then having to dodge additional landslides from those ads. Ifrit required more tank swaps and good defensive cooldown management and invulnerability timing. And it was a lot, but also a lot of fun to see myself actually improve and become a better player. So that was pretty cool. Oh, and as a fun little thing, during Nails, Ifrit could be pushed past his current Nail phase. If this happened, he'd wipe the raid with Hellfire. This can no longer happen since they made him immune past a certain HP threshold. Upon defeat of Ifrit, Garuda, or Titan, they dropped item level 90 bracelets, earrings, and rings, and had a weekly quest tied to them that rewarded one item level 90 weapon of your choice. Item level 90 was the max at the time, so with these 4 new trials on top of the weekly quest, the new 450 tome cap, and the introduction of Party Finder, getting into harder content has never felt easier. Also, if you are lucky, sometimes a Nightmare Whistle dropped from the extremes, excluding Ultimate Weapon, which was an extremely rare mount at the time. The unique mounts the Realm Reborn Extremes dropped didn't come until 2.2, so Nightmare was the only rare mount from these at the time. And if gearing wasn't made easy enough with all these new alternatives, patch 2.1 also added the Duty Roulette, which could be done daily and offered increased Tome, Gil, and EXP rewards. Accompanied by the Duty Roulette was 3 new dungeons: Faris Cirrus, Copperbell Mines Hard, and Hawkeye Manor Hard. All of these can be done pretty much authentically through minimum item level, except Faris Cirrus, which did receive some nerfs because it was too hard for the general populace. And I remember people getting into this dungeon only to instantly leave upon seeing its Faris Cirrus and taking the 30-minute penalty. That's how bad it was. Speaking of bad, we had the MSQ, which wasn't bad, but the 19 quests you had to do was kind of bad. Thankfully, just like how Endwalker reduced the amount of quests a Realm Reborn base MSQ had, Shadowbringers reduced all the Realm Reborn patch quests, bringing down patch 2.1's quests from 19 to 10. Just like with the base A Realm Reborn story, I'm not going to talk too much about it because, again, I'm no story expert. I consume it and I enjoy it, but I don't want to make it a focus of this video other than saying I enjoyed it, even though it was so many quests. Something that is worth mentioning though is the new trial they added in patch 2.1, which was Good King Moogle Hard. And for this being a mandatory story trial, it was a real pain in the ass to do with pugs due to the coordination required, but it was doable. Basically, you had to kill the Moogles in a specific order, and failing to do so resulted in a wipe. And you'd see a lot of wipes, sometimes disbands. But it wasn't that bad if everyone just worked together and followed the kill order correctly. Thankfully, this fight has since been changed and streamlined into a much more modern take on encounter design with much easier to digest mechanics, take some towers, dodge some AoEs, simple stuff really. None of that kill order mess the fight used to have. And then there's the PvP, possibly one of the pieces of content that has undergone the most significant changes throughout Final Fantasy XIV's lifespan. Patch 2.1 introduced the first PvP game mode, the Wolves Den, a simple 4v4 versus team deathmatch, and that was it. I actually remember playing a few games, getting absolutely steamrolled as a scholar, and then getting roasted in game chat. Great memories. Anyway, unlike now, you had your entire PvE toolkit on top of some additional PvP exclusive abilities which you had to unlock through progressing your PvP rank. I don't know, it was weird. But your hotbar, as a result, ended up as a bloody mess, and I'd probably get scorned for this opinion, but I definitely don't miss it compared to Endwalker's PvP, which is flat out a lot more accessible and enjoyable. Oh, also, gear worked in PvP, and there was this PvP exclusive gear which had the stat Morale, which increased your damage done and reduced your damage taken, so there were optimal PvP sets, as wild as that sounds. This, of course, was also the patch they released the show known as Housing. Back then, there were only 3 districts, the Lavender Beds, the Mist, and the Goblet, and 5 wards with a division, totaling 450 houses per server, which were only purchasable by a free company, and there was no lottery system, so it was first come, first serve. Admittedly, the game was less popular during Realm Reborn compared to now, and if your server wasn't a super populated one, you could potentially grab a house for your free company. SE have gone through leaps and bounds to make housing today a lot more accessible, but the system itself is still fairly criticized because it's kind of just and it really should just be instance housing. But anyway, I don't want to make this video too much about my opinion in that regard. Patch 2.1 also introduced the Esthetician, which allows you to change certain features about your character without the need of a Fantasia, which at the time you could only get one of from the Veteran Reward rank system. Speaking of Veteran Rewards, these have been changed considerably. It used to take well over 1,000 subscribed days to get all 13 currently available Veteran rank rewards, which is quite a lot. So in an effort to make these rewards more accessible, Veteran rank rewards were condensed to 4 ranks, totaling up to 330 days, with the remaining Veteran reward rank items being obtainable in-game, mostly through the achievement point vendor in Old Gridania, but the Fantasia now is a quest reward from the Ultima weapon. This patch also added Beast Tribe quests, Hildebrand, treasure hunts, and the die preview, but these are really no consequence and keep their authenticity up to today, so I won't be talking about Hildebrand every time I mention it. I'll simply be mentioning it, and that's it. Still, all these new features and content was definitely a lot to keep us happy for a while, on top of the smaller patches 2.15 and 2.16, which came with various changes like nerfing the Thorn March Hard, and quality of life features such as improving the visual effect of AoEs, adding the ready check function, introducing waymarks, the ability to highlight enemies, and even adding the sprout icon to new players. March the 26th, 2014 was the day patch 2.2 Through the Maelstrom was released, A Realm Reborn's second major patch. Adding in more main scenario with a brand new trial, 2 new extreme trials, more Hildebrand quests accompanied by another trial, 3 new dungeons, the second raid tier, new Beast Tribe quests, the Sahagin and Kobolds, relic updates, and a plethora of system updates and additions that further reinforced Final Fantasy XIV's core foundation. The main scenario of 2.2 continued the trend of adding in 19 new quests that have since been reduced to 14. With this new story came my beloved Yugiri, and a new mandatory trial, Leviathan Hard. By this time, SE learnt their lesson to not make story trials require as much coordination or have as much punishment as good King Moogle Mog did. Although there were some wipes to be expected with the shield generator timing, it wasn't as bad. Both of which also received extreme variants, with Leviathan offering item level 95 weapons which could be upgraded to item level 100, and King Moogle rewarding item level 100 necklaces. By this time I was a bit better at the game. So Leviathan and King Moogle Extreme didn't give me too much trouble and felt on a similar level in terms of difficulty compared to Garuda, Ifrit and Titan Extreme. Although there were some hiccups. For one, in Leviathan there was this ad that you had to stun just at the right time so he didn't cast his AoE that causes anyone to walk into it hysteria. And with the little room you already have to dodge, having this AoE placed was bad news. Especially that if you did get knocked off or walked off due to hysteria, you were dead for the remainder of the encounter. So learning this stun timing was pretty important. And look, you can go back and do this fight now, min item level, and wonder, what the are you talking about? That stun is easy. And again, this was early days. Skill levels were different. Be gentle. King Moogle Extreme, on the other hand, was also a tight fight, with how the tanks had to constantly swap ads, and we used to tank the ads and King Moogle opposite of each other, rotating around the room to avoid the bard who would buff the ads or the king, and also dodging the bad AoEs, which got hectic at times. Hildebrand also added a new trial battle on the big bridge, and with so many trials now available in the game, came the Duty Roulette trials. Patch 2.2 also continued the trend of adding 3 new dungeons per major patch, those being the Lost City of Amdapar, Halatali Hard, and Brayfox Longstop Hard. The Lost City of Amdapar is probably the most notable with its final boss, Diablos. If you've done this dungeon, then you're probably familiar with his doors and his Ruinous Omen cast, which can just be treated like a raid wide now. But during A Realm Reborn, you couldn't simply take the damage of this ability. You had to open 2 doors of the same matching symbol, which sucked the party into one of those doors and slowly transported them to the other side while being immune to all damage. How we did this is have one player be the Doormaster, mark the doors of the same matching symbol and be in charge of opening the doors during the Ruinous Omens cast to avoid a wipe. With these 3 new dungeons also came a new weekly tombstone, the Allagan Tombstone of Soldiery, and Mythology's weekly cap was removed, with Philosophy being discontinued but exchangeable for Mythology for a limited time. With a new tombstone also came a new item level 100 gear set, which at the time wasn't the max item level of 110, which was unlike how Mythology worked. You had to upgrade the gear with items that could only be found in the second raid tier at the time. Farming these new tombstones was made a lot easier with the new Duty Rilla Expert and speedrunning Brayflock's Long Stop Hard, which was the most efficient dungeon to run at the time due to the sheer amount of mobs you could pull between bosses, and if you wanted to cap your soldiery fast for the week or just farm Mythology, this was the way to go. But for those who wanted max item level, their only choice was to attempt the second coil of Bahamut. The number of turns for this raid tier was reduced from 5 to 4, but that's mostly because the binding coil of Bahamut turn 3 was utterly pointless. And these fights were more known for being called turn 6, 7, 8, and 9. At this point, I finally transferred off the NA server Siren to an EU server Odin, so I could raid at more reliable hours for my time zone. I do want to mention that the second coil kept the tradition of fighting trash before the boss fight, but it was all very simplified and straightforward, so nothing really to talk too much on. For a while, until I could find a raid group, I ended up pugging through Party Finder, and it was rough. The second coil of Bahamut turn 1, or more known as turn 6, had the boss Reflasia, which wasn't too bad and actually reduced 3 mechanics we still see today: chains, briar patches, and stillness. Thorny Vine were unique chains, as they could tether to multiple players, but the concept was the same: run opposite of each other to break them. The briar patches spawned due to these bulb enemies, which could be ignored except if one spawned in the middle, which needed to be killed. These briar patches took a lot of room, slowed, and did damage over time to anyone standing in them, but were used to avoid Reflasia's devour. Blighted Bouquet, which was the stillness, happened about halfway into the fight and would kill anyone who continued to move or execute abilities. This fight also had a whole ass intended mechanic about a third into the fight, but everyone just ignored it and burned the boss. Entering the third phase, 3 slugs spawned which got Castrel beat. Then Reflasia drops 3 AoE puddles which become 3 slime ads. These do raid-wide, giving everyone a stacking debuff which does more damage for every stack, and at 10 stacks it hurts a lot, serving as an enrage of sorts. However, the intended way to do this was to keep one slug alive, feed it the slimes, which makes it a super slug with a lot of health and does a ton of damage, so you'd need to kill it fast with a melee LB. And after a while, more slugs and more slimes would spawn, and the cycle repeats until the boss or the party is dead. But with the ignore strategy, no more slugs or slimes would spawn, so you could just focus on burning down the boss, which proved to be the most popular method. The real nightmare though? Turn 7 Melusine. This fight made me realize I needed a raid group, as doing this with pugs at the time was seemingly impossible. The main gimmick to turn 7 were the Petrify debuffs, Curse Voice and Curse Shriek. If you've done the Abyssus 8 Circle Savage, you'll be familiar with this mechanic. Curse Voice petrified anyone the player stared at in a cone in front of them, once the timer expired. Curse Shriek, on the other hand, petrified anyone within the player's line of sight. Players caught were petrified for an entire minute and were pretty much guaranteed to die due to Melusine's fireballs, which she used fairly often throughout the encounter. Melusine also spawned ads for each phase push, and needed to be taken care of as soon as possible. If Melusine or her ads were caught by a voice or a shriek, they would get a permanent damage up stack, except the Renards, who spawned with a 1 minute heavy debuff, and actually needed to be kited by a range and petrified so they can be used as a form of line of sight for the players targeted by Curse Shriek. The Petrify only lasted a minute, and Renards needed to be killed before the Petrify runs off, otherwise they'd zoom around the map, one-shotting the party one by one. In the final phase, one last ad spawns. Melusine now applies a poison that must be cleansed immediately or explodes and wipe the raids, and things get even more tight as portions of the arena become unsafe, giving less room for the party to work with. For a second fight in a tier, this was pretty tough. Basically, tanks needed to be on point, ready to pick up the ads. Healers needed to keep up with the insane amount of damage and cleansing poisons, the range had to manage the Renard, and everyone else needed to keep their eye on debuffs to not PvP each other, or hit the ads or mellow sign with their voices. And I somehow really struggled with this. Remember that during a Realm Reborn, even on EU servers, we still had high ping, because the servers weren't actually located within EU, so you had to turn your character away around 3 seconds if you wanted to be on the safe side. Eventually I ended up finding and joining a raid group that was progressing turn 9 and carried me through this fight after seeing the final phase several times. I also got a free ride through turn 8, which thankfully didn't feel as difficult as turn 7, but it did have its own form of difficulty. The Avatar, turn 8's boss, had a few unique mechanics which I think are interesting because some of these have never been repeated while others have. The most notable being the 4 bio towers in each cardinal. Bio towers activate in sets of 2 and 3. Once activated, they start to charge, and once they charge 5 times, they do their special ability. North Tower spawns a dreadnought that must be picked up by the tank, faced away from the party, heavily mitigated, and burned down as fast as possible. East Tower spawns 3 random landmines that must be taken within the next 15 seconds or they'll wipe the raid, and South and West Tower deal raid-wide damage. If 2 towers charge the same amount of stacks at the same time, Avatar gets damage up stacks. If 2 towers reach 5 charges and use their ability at the same time, Avatar will wipe the raid. To avoid this outcome, players could enter the tower to force a charge depending on the amount of players, 1 charge for each player. This mechanic hasn't really been repeated, but it's understandable given how pug unfriendly it is. Still, doing this fight with a raid group and good communication gave it a unique experience because the encounter required the group to adapt to different situations, but also was flexible with what kind of strategy you were going for. Some groups took their time with the towers and charged them in a controlled manner. Some groups brute forced the towers, dealing with more damage but also less thinking, and I think that's just pretty cool. A few standout mechanics include Brainjack, which forced the main tank to attack the nearest target, so we'd place a melee DPS inside the hitbox of the Avatar for the main tank to attack. Ballistic Missile, which targeted 2 random players with either a small ring or a large ring. Small rings required 2 players, while a large ring required 3. We just stacked these 2 players on top of each other. If it was 2 small rings, it would solve itself. If it was 1 small and 1 large, another player would need to step at the edge of the large circle, and if it was too large, then again just 1 outside player could step in and solve it. If there were too many or too less players, everyone in the circle would instantly be killed, which made this mechanic extremely punishing if done incorrectly. And Allegan Field, which targets a random non-tank player for 30 seconds, and any damage that player receives once the time expires is doubled and dealt as raid-wide damage. So it's important for the Allegan Field player to not participate in any mechanics that involve damage for the duration. And that was just turn 8. Turn 9's Nail Dias Darnus ups the ante even more and was my first taste of progression raiding with a dedicated group. Turn 9 is known for being the hardest encounter in all of A Realm Reborn, and just like its predecessor, Twintania, Nail was a long and arduous fight, with multiple phases introducing new mechanics along the way. Turn 9 could also be solo tanked, just like Turn 5. In fact, most of the second coil of Bahamut could be. I even solo tanked Turn 8. That said, even though these could be solo tanked, that didn't make it the thing to do. It was just an option, and some raid groups decided to do it for some encounters, and others just stuck with 2 tanks throughout the entire raid tier. Nowadays, fights are specifically designed for 2 tanks, and I think that's good because having the off tank within a group have to gear up and learn to play a DPS kind of sucks when they signed up to play a tank. Anyway, Turn 9 has 4 phases to it. Phase 1 has 1 random player targeted by a red or orange meteor for every Stardust cast, and these must be placed around the arena and not too close to one another, otherwise they'll explode and wipe the raid. Simple enough, we just use the markings on the floor to measure the correct distance. She also does a bunch of other stuff in Phase 1 and throughout the fight, like Ravenspeak, a tank buster which inflicted the main tank with a 12-second debuff that explodes around them for even more damage to the target and anyone around them, which hurt a lot. That of course wasn't everything, as she also had Meteor Streams, which hit 4 random players with splash AoEs, forcing everyone to spread out, and then Dulamud dived the main tank for even more damage. And if that wasn't enough, she also dived to a random player and did either a Iron Chariot, a point blank AoE that would push anyone caught by it into the wall and die, or Lunar Dynamo, a donor AoE that would heal Nail if anyone was caught by it. Oh, and she also had a stack which she'd put on a random player, which everyone would have to stack for, or that player would die. Wow, that's surprising. After pushing Nail past 65%, she enters phase 2 and becomes untargetable. This was considered the ad phase. 3 random players got these green meteors, which work just like the previous meteors, but are placed near the center of the arena instead as they spawn golems. 1 green, 1 blue, and 1 red. The green had to be picked up by a tank due to its heavy damage, and killed first to avoid the demolish cast, which if got off dealt really heavy raid-wide damage. While the red just left AoE puddles and earthquakes, and the blue had a draw-in cast and earthshock, which had to be silenced or it would deal heavy raid-wide damage and leave everyone paralyzed. These 2 could be picked up by anyone, so if you're solo tanking, then that was okay. They also did a color swap about halfway through this part of the phase, so killing the green golem off first was important so a DPS or healer didn't end up tanking a green golem. The tank who was tanking the green golem can also provoke a golem off a non-tank golem to keep things in control. The reason we couldn't just group them up and had to separate them was because if they got too close to each other, they would merge and form a super golem, wiping the raid. Those meteors we left during the Stardust also need to be dealt with now. Luckily, the golems can eat them, so we feed each golem up to 2 meteors. This does buff them, however, with either a haste if they eat an orange meteor, or a damage up if they eat a red meteor. And if they ate 4 meteors, they turn into a super golem, wiping the raid. And once you've dealt with all that, more meteors target players, just like how they did in phase 1, but this time in a lot quicker succession and could target the same player twice. So there were multiple ways to do this. Some groups had every player spread out in a clock block around the arena, rotating and making room for each other. One strat had everyone stand in the center and have designated clock spots to drop their meteors and rotate clockwise or counterclockwise depending on if they got their spots taken by another player who got multiple meteors. Some groups just started south, popped sprint the moment someone got a meteor, and ran around the map and prayed that the meteors wouldn't explode. My first group did the middle strat, and it worked for us quite well. After the 9 meteors were placed, 3 players got targeted again by green meteors, repeating the same process with the golems and meteors, but this time having more meteors to deal with, depending on the phase 1 push. Nail then begins casting Mega Flare, a hard-hitting raid-wide that needed mitigation, which is funny looking back at it, because party mitigation was only available to healers. Scholars had Galvanize and Sacred Soil, and White Mage had Protect and Stone Skin, which meant our White Mage had to manually Stone Skin everyone in the party before the Mega Flare cast was finished. After Mega Flare, Nail Dolomod dived the tank again and then cast Heaven's Fall, which if you've done the Unending Coil of Bahamut, you'll recognize this, as it almost works exactly the same here. Stand too close and it will kill you. Stand too far and it will hit you into the wall, also killing you. It also did a few different AoE patterns which were easy enough to avoid until she started throwing out supernovas, which were these dark AoE puddles that would deal high damage and slow anyone caught by them. Nail also did a 2 consecutive hit tank buster called Bahamut's Claw, rather than Ravenspeak in this phase. After a while, Nail applied Garrote Twist to a random player, giving them a stacking debuff of Garrote. Once it reached 9 stacks, that player would die, but it was simple enough to deal with, because an ad spawns with the solution. This ad hit hard, and also casted fireballs, similar to the ads in turn 5. Once sub 50%, the ad tethered 2 random players, applying them with Garrote stacks. So here, we needed to cast RLB both the ad and the boss. Once the ad died, it dropped 3 of these white puddles, which the 3 Garrote players needed to pick up to cleanse their debuff, and that was pretty much phase 3. Once Nail was pushed past 47%, she would enter phase 4. She maintained a lot of attacks from previous phases like Supernova, Iron Chariot, Lunar Dynamo, Pharmonic Beam, and Bahamut's Claw, but this time she casted Bahamut's Favor before each set, buffing herself with a damage up stack, and hitting 5 claws rather than 2. What really spiced this phase up though was the 3 elemental dragons that spawned outside the arena. A lightning dragon that afflicted a random player with Thunderstruck, which once expired dealt heavy damage to the player, and anyone around them would receive the same damage and be debuffed with a paralyze. The fire dragon, which will fireball a random player with an AoE, inflicting them and anyone close by with Scorched, which made the next fireball a one-shot. And the ice dragon, which iceballed every player in a random order, inflicting them with Frostbitten, making the next iceball a one-shot. You see the pattern here? Again, if you've done UCOB, you'll be no stranger to this mechanic, but basically you have to be hit by the fireball to remove the Frostbitten, and be hit by ice to remove Scorched. We handle this by just stacking up in front of Nail, as Nail doesn't cleave anymore during this phase, and then having every even fire in the group and every odd fire outside. And Thunders just went to the left or right of Nail to avoid hitting the group or the outside fire player at the time. But that wasn't the only trick the dragons had. They also randomly targeted 2 random players with these green marks. Once the mark disappears, the dragon will dive bomb that location. The first mark will have 2 dragons dive bomb, and the second mark will have the last dragon dive bomb. So to deal with this, my group had me, the off tank, use the waymarks and figure out where the 2 players with the markers were going to bait the dive bombs to keep the middle safe. How I did this was look north, find the first 2 dragons clockwise. These were the first 2 dragons to dive. So I put the A mark between them, and then that left the last dragon to dive. So I just put the marks to the side of that dragon. And yes, you could place waymarks during combat, something that is no longer possible. Thanks TPS. Either way, this was possibly the most responsibility I've had up to this point, and at first I was hesitant, but it kind of filled me with excitement. I'd learn and understand a mechanic that no one else really needed to, and it kind of led me to stepping up to more of these situations in the future, like marking players during Rough Flames in DSR, or during Sigma and Omega in Top, so I'm kind of grateful for that. Anyway, the dive bombs were the last mechanic this fight had up its sleeve. Once you dealt with those, the rotation would repeat until the boss is dead, or the fight reached 13 minutes, which at this point she'd cast another Mega Flare, but this time was her and Rich. And clearing this fight honestly felt pretty good. It was the first time I progged a fight from start to finish in a single group, had a role of responsibility, and it was just a hard and punishing fight which tested my consistency and skill level. The second coil of Bahamut was considered the hardest of the 3 raid tiers released throughout A Realm Reborn, with Order of the Blue Garter once again claiming Rod first, and the tier even received the first iteration of a Savage difficulty variant in patch 2.3, which rewarded players with prestigious titles for clearing each turn, for those wanting an even greater challenge. It's also something a lot of raiders didn't even attempt until patch 2.5, myself included, due to just how brutally difficult these encounters were. They did more damage, carried even more mechanics into new phases, and just were a lot more punishing. Turn 7 and 9 Savage being the most notorious. Turn 7 required strict phase pushing, and instead of 2 Venoms, the healers needed to cleanse 4 Venoms immediately, or risk a wipe. And yes, this was a time where percentage pushing was a thing rather than it being time-based like it is now. So that made some fights pretty wild when you needed to push an encounter at a very specific point, at a very specific percentage of HP. And that's not even going over turn 9, which required strict positioning with 2 Thunders instead of 1, the tank having an AoE around them for every Raven's Beak into last phase, which made dealing with fireballs really chaotic. It was a whole mess, but clearing these encounters gave a whole new feeling of satisfaction. After weeks of progression and putting in the hours to get together as a raid group and figure these out together, it was just kind of amazing. So imagine my disappointment when I found out you could just unsync these in Heaven's Ward and beyond with minimal effort and still obtain the titles. But I digress. How about we talk about something truly sad? Atma. More specifically, the Atma grind for a Zodiac Relic. Now you probably have one of several reactions. Atmas aren't that bad. What is Atma? Or, yeah. If you know, you know. But that's what I'm here for. To explain to you just how bad the Atma grind was during A Realm Reborn. To upgrade your relic from Zenith to Atma, you had to grind 12 Atmas from A Realm Reborn zones. The drop rates for these were bad. People would spend entire days in a single zone just trying to get a single Atma, and they had to get 12 in total. So, yeah. It was bad. So bad that people even speculated theories on the drop rates, claiming that Atmas had higher drop rate windows during certain hours of the day, and people even claimed this to work. I myself even gave it a go, and it felt like my drop rates improved, but it was purely placebo. Still, even with all my free time, this grind took me well over a week. Probably 2, but my memory is pretty hazy considering that was almost 10 years ago. But what I do remember is just how much it got the community together to share in this painful grind. People congratulating each other on their jobs, talking about how long they've been at the grind, how many more Atmas they have to get, and other completely unrelated things, and it was just kind of nice. It really brought out the social aspect of Final Fantasy XIV, and I'll always look back on it fondly, regardless of how miserable the drop rates were. With such an arduous grind, you'd think the next step must be a bit more relaxed, right? And then came the books. Patch 2.2 also came with the Anima step, which involved buying 9 books for tomes and then fulfilling the contents within the books. Each book had 4 objectives: slay 100 specific enemies in sets of 10, and complete 3 specific dungeons, fates, and lev quests. The worst offender being the 3 fates, because they were really stubborn to spawn sometimes. Killing 100 enemies per a book also kind of sucked, but at least it was relatively straightforward. Both steps have since been made easier to accomplish. Atma drop rates were significantly increased, and the enemies to slay were reduced from 100 to just 30. A much welcome change. So yeah, lots of content, but none of that compared to the single most important thing they added to this patch: glamour. and it was extremely convoluted. To actually unlock Glamour, you needed access to Mordona and be level 50. Glamour prisms were also very different. These could only be crafted, and there were Glamour prisms for every crafter. Armorer Glamour prism, level worker, cloth craft, etc. So, for example, you wanted a robe glamoured onto another robe. You needed a Glamour prism cloth craft. Oh, and also they had various grades. Grade 1 glamoured item level 0 to 40, grade 2 glamoured item level 41 to 80, and so on. Didn't have your crafter's level to make prisms? Off to the market board you went. We also didn't have the Glamour dresser or Glamour plates, so the only way to store Glamours was through our retainers. As bad as this all sounds, we were just happy we could Glamour at all, especially when patch 2.2 came with possibly some of the ugliest home gear I've ever seen. Jank aside, this patch made a huge effort to add a lot of quality of life and new features, like gardening if you own a house, assigning a retainer a class and sending them off on a venture, the challenge log, big fishing, introducing the Echo to the first raid tier, and a few weeks after the launch of patch 2.2 came the PlayStation 4 release. Overall, patch 2.2 added a lot and kept the community happy for a while. As tradition goes, we also got a few smaller patches before our next big patch, those being patch 2.21, 2.25, and 2.28. 2.28 being the highlight here, which added the sightseeing log, refined PvP by removing the rank restriction on PvP actions, and adding in the 5th stage Novus to the Zodiac relic weapons. Novus was possibly one of the most relaxed stages. Buy free enchanted inks for some tomes, trade inks to NPC, get scroll, infuse scroll with 75 materia of your choice. Each infusion required an Alexandrite. Alexandrite could be obtained from Fates or buying mysterious maps for some tomes, and there was some RNG to your materia failing to infuse, but thankfully the odds were always in your favour. Patch 2.2 also gave us a redesigned goblet with a clear view, as the initial design was pretty criticised for being ugly, with mountains blocking most of the view. We also got a gear preview window, a title display, auto-skip cutscenes, and a lot of other small quality of life adjustments that just went a really long way into improving the game. And just as patch 2.3 was on the horizon, Fantasias were available to purchase, but were limited to quantities of 1, 3, or 5 vials, up to a combined total of 9 vials, and that was it. You couldn't buy any more after that. They did obviously end up changing this low, but if you did buy any of these bundles before the changes, they apply to every one of your characters. So I bought one before the change, and now every new character I make gets a Fantasia from the Heavensward Collector's Edition, a Fantasia from the old Veteran Rewards, and also one from the old bundle, which is pretty neat. July the 8th, 2014, and we're almost halfway through all the patches. Just like previous major patches, 2.3 Defenders of Eorzea added a ton of new content. New MSQ and Hildebrand quests, a new PvP game mode, the second Alliance raid, a new Extreme Trial, 3 new dungeons, Hullbreaker Isles, the Tamtara Deepcroft Hard, and the Stone Vigil Hard, a new Beast Tribe, the Exile, and a bunch of other things like the Hunt, item level sync, item desynthesis, Chocobo raising, personal housing, and private chambers in FC houses, along with additional wards and the 6th stage in the Zodiac Relic series. The new main scenario once again added in 19 quests, which again got reduced to 14, and a new trial, Ramu. Now, Ramu Hard was pretty straightforward, and you probably know the drill. But something you might not know is when he summoned his free ads, he didn't go immune like he does now. So you could actually push him into his next phase while the ads were still up. The only problem here, though, is if the ads were still up, he'd instantly wipe the raid with Judgment Bolt. Ramu Extreme, on the other hand, genuinely gave us some trouble. The problem with Ramu Extreme was he spawned these orbs. The tanks needed 3 orbs to get surge protection, which kept them alive through Ramu's attacks, but we couldn't leave too many orbs on the field, as Ramu does more damage the more orbs are on the field. So the idea was to always leave 3 for the tanks and clean up the remainder. Not hard in theory, but phase pushes would sometimes cause a set of orbs to be skipped, and that would mess with things, as the group also needed 3 orbs going into the final phase to get rid of Rolling Thunder. So what did players come up with to counter the awkwardness of this trial? Titan Eggy. Yup. Titan Eggy could comfortably tank Ramuh without even needing surge protection due to his massive resistance to AoE damage, which Ramuh's autos and tank busters counted as. Titan Eggy also scaled with Summoner's HP, so having a Summoner with Vitality melds or accessories further increased Titan Eggy's survivability. Although if the Summoner or Titan Eggy died, the run was pretty much over. That said, it did simplify the fight a lot, completely eliminating orb management and the DPS check. The problem with this strategy is it excluded tanks from groups and party finders, and, well, completely cheesed the mechanic. And so it was swiftly nerfed in a hotfix update, making tanks once again needed. Ramuh Extreme rewarded item level 100 weapons and rings, with the rings being further upgraded to item level 110 in patch 2.28. Patch 2.3 also added Frontlines, a large-scale PvP game mode which revolved around the 3 grand companies forming 3 teams of 24 players each to battle it out, and there was no freelance option either. The grand company you were in was the team you represented in Frontlines, so if your friend was in the Maelstrom and you were in the Order of the Twin Adder, you couldn't actually queue together, which kind of sucked. Frontlines debuted with the Borderlands Ruin Secure, a capture the flag-esque game mode with several points around the map to hold and generate score. Every few minutes, drones would spawn at the center of the map, and this is where most conflicts happened, which created opportunities for teams to go around the map, capturing flags while the rest were busy in the center, which of course led to more conflicts around the map. This is the last we'll talk about PvP in this video, but there are a few things to note that are different to our iteration today, like how gear continued to work in Frontlines, but the morale stat was rendered useless. Limit Break was shared between the party and didn't change to individual limit breaks until Adrenaline was added along with the Borderlands Ruin Slaughter, a pure team deathmatch in patch 2.5. And the Borderlands Ruins has since been temporarily disabled since patch 6.4, with no word on when it's coming back. But hey, maybe by the time you're watching this video, it's back. Who knows? With that talked about, how about we set our attention back to PvE with Cypress Tower, A Realm Reborn's second Alliance raid. Not much has really changed from then to now, except just how fast the DPS is and how prone the Alliance is to skipping or completely ignoring some mechanics, which we're gonna talk about because there's quite a bit. The first boss has mechanics which can pretty much be ignored and everyone just burns her down. Players frozen can be ignored, as annoying as that is. Players with fireballs can ignore the fact that they have a fireball coming towards them, but they should totally unfreeze the frozen players. And players with thunder orbs don't even need to care. But during A Realm Reborn, it was important that players who got frozen were freed with the fireballs to create water puddles, which gave resistance to her attack, Ancient Flare. If there were no water puddles, it could very easily spell a wipe. The Thunder Orbs also charged these towers, which each alliance needs fully charged for her ability Daybreak. Once she casts Daybreak, each alliance needs to go to their tower and stand on it to activate a shield which blocks the attack. If the attack isn't blocked, or you aren't standing on your platform, then you'll be petrified for 30 seconds. And if this happened to everyone, this pretty much resulted in a wipe. But good luck ever seeing this attack now, because it simply doesn't happen anymore. The second boss, Glacier, suffers a similar fate to the first boss, and has been reduced to a mere HP sponge, but it wasn't always this way. Before Glacier died in mere moments, he spawned these ads around the arena which tethered to him, charging his gauge. These needed to be intercepted by players running into them, stunning themselves and the ad in the process, leaving the rest of the players to deal with them. Glacier then casted Deathstream, which, if fully charged, would wipe the raid, but as long as everyone intercepted and killed the ads, all it did was some raid-wide damage. After that, an ad spawns for each alliance, and pillars around the map tether to the boss. The ads needed to be positioned to intercept the tethers and then killed, which will activate these launch pads around the arena for each alliance, which need to be used as Glacier casts another death stream, but this time it will actually cause death for everyone in the center of the platform. The rest is a simple case of going around these platforms and killing all the ads, and then returning to the center platform to finally defeat Glacier. So yeah, that was quite a bit that you just don't see anymore, which is honestly kind of a shame, because the only people who really experienced this were the A Realm Reborn boomers, maybe Heavensward as well. Oh well. As for the third and fourth boss, Ammon and Xandi, well, you still see most mechanics here. We had the occasional wipe to Ammon thanks to the Flame Toad players freeing every encased ice player and not leaving anything for Curtain Call, and Xandi actually required the stacks to be separated and for every one of the golden orbs to be soaked, or it could very well much wipe us. Now the stacks can be stacked together, and one or two golden orbs not being soaked won't wipe the raid anymore. This patch was also the first introduction to the hunts, adding B, A, and S ranks throughout the world, and it works pretty much the same after all these years. B ranks are weekly hunt marks with frequent spawn rates, although the spawn rate wasn't as high as it is now back in A Realm Reborn. A ranks have longer respawn times, and S ranks have respawn timers, but also need to meet certain conditions and be forcefully spawned through actions like killing a certain amount of enemies or gathering a certain amount of items, a number at a time under specific weather conditions and time. Anyway, I'm not a hunt guy, but back in A Realm Reborn, it was the new thing, and everyone interacted with it. S-ranks felt like real-world bosses that didn't die in mere seconds, and even managed to kill a fair few players every time. It was good fun. But the real reason why everybody did this was because the upgrade items tied to it, which was the only way to upgrade your gear from item level 100 to 110, without relying on raiding or raid drops. And Alliance raids at the time didn't give out the weekly token for these either. And that was pretty much it for patch 2.3. Still a large patch, but not much to talk about, although I do want to make a brief mention of the 6th Zodiac relic weapon stage, Nexus, added in patch 2.28. Nexus was the first iteration of a light farm weapon step, which some of you may be familiar with if you've done a Heavensward or a Stormblood relic weapon, or you've just done this relic as well. And it's a really simple grind. All you have to do is find duties that yield high amounts of light and are clearable in a timely manner and farm them. The only problem was, back in A Realm Reborn, we didn't have the option to unsync. So any duty we wanted to farm, we had to farm them synced, as level 50 was the max at the time. So it wasn't really synced, but you get the point. But in any case, that made it a lot more time consuming compared to now. Still, it was enough to keep us occupied until patch 2.4. October the 8th, 2014, patch 2.4 Dreams of Ice launches. With it came the third and final raid tier, a new job, Ninja, 3 new dungeons, Snowcloak, Satasha Hard, and the Sunken Temple of Quanhard, more main scenario and Hildebrand quests, 2 new trials, 1 extreme trial, and a few other miscellaneous things like subdivisions being added to all wards and not just a select few, a new weekly tome, and the 7th relic weapon stage that we'll go over. You're probably bored of hearing this right about now, but 2.4 added 19 new main scenario quests, which was reduced to 18. So yeah, 1 less quest, which kind of gives you an idea of how much more focused the story was getting up till this point, and how it was gearing up towards the Heavensward expansion. A new mandatory dungeon, Snowcloak, also came in the MSQ, and it's seen some changes. The overall structure of the dungeon is the same, and the first and third boss mostly remain the same, with the third boss having some visual clarity added to it and an additional cone move. But the focus here is the second boss, Yeti, which has seen a complete overhaul since A Realm Reborn. Yeti's original main mechanic was Frozen Mist, a large cone or AoE. This turned the Spriggans that would spawn around the map into snowballs. These snowballs could be hit an additional 2 more times with Frozen Mist to further increase their size, making them do more damage to Yeti, and was the only feasible way to actually deal damage to Yeti. He'd also cast Norvalies, a hard-hitting raid wide and inflicting everyone with a vulnerability. The way to avoid this was hitting a snowball into Yeti to interrupt the cast. Ogres would also spawn and attempt to destroy any snowballs you currently have, so burning these adds down was pretty much needed. Compare all that to today's Yeti and you have a completely different fight. It's been very standardized and really all you're doing here is dodging AoEs. After clearing Snowcloak and progressing through the MSQ, we got a new trial fight, Shiva, which, like Ramuh, was very straightforward when it came to the hard mode. As for the extreme, which was the last extreme of the expansion by the way, I'd say it was a lot easier than Ramuh Extreme and really just upped the intensity from hard mode. The only things that really caught people off guard was her sword cleave now being a group stack, her bow one-shotting anyone caught by its massive AoE, and people not knowing how to stay still during thin ice and getting frozen by the wall. But it was nothing crazy to write home about. Shiva dropped item level 110 weapons that could be upgraded to item level 115 and item level 120 bracelets. Along with adding a completely new job to the mix, Ninja, also came the third raid tier, the final coil of Bahamut, which included turn 10, 11, 12, and 13. And if you couldn't tell, was the final raid tier in A Realm Reborn. This raid tier, in my opinion, was the most accessible while keeping in line with the current player skill of the player base at the time. And overall, my most enjoyable experience raiding during a Realm Reborn, as I tried and cleared the tier as multiple different roles, but kept a tank for my first clears and progression. Turn 10's I'm the Good was a pretty straightforward encounter, but had some unique mechanics to keep things interesting. There was also a whole trash section before I'm the Good, but because this was the patch they introduced Ninja, they could bypass this entire section with Hide, which was pretty funny. You could also just bypass the section without a ninja if you knew how to stealth through the mobs, but that's besides the point. As soon as I'm the Good is pulled, the outer rings of the arena filled up with electricity and would slowly progress until the entire arena is covered, which not only served as a softened rage, but also gave us less room to work with the longer the fight went on for. He also had a check for mechanical error with electric charge. The more mechanics that were messed up, the more charges I'm the Good would get, which increased the damage of a future raid wide. Typically, we pulled and faced I'm the Good north, so his frontal cleaves only hit the tanks and his back cleaves would cover the middle of the arena when baited, but it was easy enough to avoid. He'd also occasionally hit the tank with critical rip, a tank buster. That said, his most standout mechanics were Prey, Wild Charge, Heat Lightning, and Cyclonic Chaos. Prey targeted a random player and needed to be shielded with Adloquium or Stone Skin, otherwise it would paralyze the player and give an electric charge stack to I'm the Good. Wild Charge targeted a random player to stun and charge towards. The group needed to mitigate this by having the stun player be as far back as possible, and the rest of the group would stack in a line. The first player to be hit took proportionally a lot more damage than the rest of the stack, and so needed to be a tank with defensive cooldowns up. At about 83%, I'm the Good entered his next phase and spawned adds. 2 sons and 2 daughters. 2 adds of the same type would buff each other if too close, so we had to split them up with each tank taking 1 son and 1 daughter. They did the same frontal and back cones I'm the Good did, so ideally one tank would face their pair north and the other south so the cleaves wouldn't overlap, but some tanks didn't do this and had no problems, so I guess that's just something my group did. The ads also did Prey just like I'm the Good, but instead of just 1 Prey, it was 2, so the healers had to coordinate who would shield what Prey, one healer taking the highest player on the party list and the other taking the lowest. Once the ads are dead, I'm the Good would use Electric Burst, and this would do more damage the more stacks he got from Electric Charge. He got more as time went on the longer in the ad phase, and for mechanical errors as mentioned. Then he would enter phase 3, and this is where Heat Lightning would come in, which hit 3 random players except for the main tank with AoEs that applied vulnerabilities and soon after used another Wild Charge. This time only players who weren't hit by the Heat Lightning need to stack. And if the off tank got hit, they'd either need to tank swap or just use their invulnerability. This meant from phase 3 onwards, you had less people stacking for the Wild Charge. At 54%, I'm the Good pushed into his second ad phase, which was identical to the first, except after 20 seconds spawned another set of ads. So we just had our caster limit break the 4 ads and then focus 1 set of ads down with all our burst before the next set spawned, otherwise it would more or less wipe due to the ads buffing each other. After that's dealt with, we'd finally be in the last phase, having a lot less room to deal with mechanics, and I'm the Good would introduce his last mechanic, Cyclonic Chaos, tethering a random player and dealing massive damage and pushing them back in an AoE around them, which had to be shared amongst the party. This mechanic was always paired with another mechanic like Heat Lightning or Wild Charge, so the party had to adjust on the fly. And that was turn 10. Decent introductory fight, in my opinion, not too hard, but not too easy either. Turn 11's Kalia was a step up from I'm the Good, but not too much more difficult. Phase 1 served as an introductory phase to Kalia's core mechanics: Resonance, Nerve Gas, Seed of the Sea and River, Secondary Head, and Primary Head. Both tanks typically stack together in this fight due to Resonance, a heavy damage frontal cleave which could be split between the tanks, and Secondary Head and Primary Head, a tank swap mechanic. Secondary Head would stun the main tank and straight after use Primary Head on whoever has aggro, which needed to be the off tank, otherwise the main tank would be instantly gibbed. Nerve Gas was a set of 3 AoEs, a front, right, and left cone that had to be dodged. At about 90%, Kalia would cast Barrow Field, which made her hitbox dangerous, dealing damage, applying a vulnerability, and a heavy to anyone who stepped in, which limited movement options, and if you got a heavy, it made dodging Nerve Gas almost impossible. Her last mechanic in this phase is Seeds of the Sea or River, which is a stack and a spread, or a spread and a stack. Depending on which one goes out first, required the group to pay attention to her heads. If the 2 outer heads fired red missiles first, then it was spreads and stacks. If her middle head fired a blue missile first, then it was stack and spread. At about 60%, Kalia will push into phase 2, the ad phase. Kalia becomes untargetable and makes the center of the arena a death zone, and 6 ads spawn: an egg, a sphere, a cube, and 3 other ads that can't be targeted, but throw out line AoEs for the party to dodge. The sphere and the cube were picked up by tanks, and the egg moved by itself. If 2 of the targetable ads got too close, they would tether, absorb each other, and make a super ad, which resulted in a wipe. Because the egg moved by itself, the idea was to progressively move around the arena as a group and burn and kill tank ads at the same time before moving on to the egg ad. The egg inflicted a random player with Fort Lightning, a debuff that once expired caused an AoE that dealt no damage to the player themselves, but anyone else caught by it would suffer damage and be paralyzed, so they had to move away from the group. The sphere had a stack, so the group would stack up behind the sphere, and the cube replaced annoying AoEs on the ground, and its autos were always critical hits on the tank. Once all the ads are killed, we enter final phase. Kalia begins this with Nerve Cloud, a critical hitting raid wide, which we needed to shield and mitigate with everything we had at the time. After Nerve Cloud, the fight continued like normal, except players now got tethered to each other and couldn't get too far from one another, or they would receive vulnerabilities or instant death depending on distance. This tether meant the tethered players had to dodge nerve gas together in synchronization and spread just the right amount for Seeds of the River, and this really kicked our asses because of how the 14 servers worked. Sometimes you'd think your tether partner is slow, so you'd wait for them just a little bit, but on their screen, they're actually further than you, and suddenly you have a stack of vulnerability now. And so this fight taught us to stop trusting the servers and start trusting each other instead. An important lesson that exists even to today. So you have Kalia to thank for that. Turn 12 is where the story of the coils really picks up, which is funny considering it's the second to last encounter, but still. I don't really want to focus on the story because, again, that's something you can enjoy even now, but it can't be ignored that Phoenix is a pretty big deal and was a step up in fight design when it came to the third turns throughout the raid tier. Phase 1 had Phoenix cast Revelation, a tank buster that inflicted the current tank with a debuff, and if they took the next Revelation with this debuff, they would die. So a tank swap was necessary between every cast, or an invulnerability. Benus would also spawn at intervals throughout Phase 1. These needed to be picked up by the current off tank, dragged to an intercardinal or the center of the arena, and burned down as they would come into play later. A short while into the fight, Phoenix cast Blackfire, which drops a puddle underneath a DPS, a healer, and the off tank, and if stayed in or stepped into, would explode and give everyone a vulnerability, and if they were too close, they would tether and continuously pulse, which pretty much resulted in a wipe. Afterwards, the 3 players targeted by Blackfire now will be targeted by Whitefire. These need to be overlapped with the Blackfires to make them killable. We handled this by having Phoenix in the center and spreading the DPS, healers, and off tank around the boss, each taking a cardinal direction, dropping our Blackfires and then dropping our Whitefires after. At about 80%, the boss would introduce 2 new mechanics: Brand of Purgatory and Flames of Unforgiveness, and Blue Fire and Red Fire. Brand of Purgatory targets either a ranged or healer and needs to be passed to another player. Passing does a small AoE around both players, and both players needed to be healed up before Flames of Unforgiveness. If Brand is still up on the original Brand player for Flames of Unforgiveness, it would straight up kill them, so passing was important. To handle this, we've simply passed the Brand back and forth between a ranged player and a healer. Blue Fire randomly targets a player and indicates a small AoE around them, which needed to be taken somewhere safe where it wouldn't hit anyone else or the boss, as it explodes and leaves a small blue fire puddle. If the boss is hit by it, it'll absorb it, and if another player is hit by it, it'll heavy them. Red Fire, however, targets a random player with a fireball and chases them. If this reaches the target or hits anyone else, it'll explode for heavy raid-wide damage and leave everyone with a burn debuff, which was just insult to injury as it was a guaranteed wipe at that point. To avoid this, we simply had the ranged player who isn't dealing with the brand take the blue fire puddle, which then gave them a buff which completely nullified the explosion of the red fire, so then they'd intercept the red fire orb, which would solve the mechanic. Then at about 52%, Phoenix enters phase 3, becomes invulnerable, summons a wall of fire that kills anyone who touches it, and spams Flames of Rebirth, a raid wide that does more damage with each cast and revives all dead Benus. And here's where the Benus come into play. The Benus upon reviving will do a small AoE around them that will buff other Benus or Phoenix caught by it. But because we spread them out beforehand, this isn't a problem. They'll also have automatic aggro on the tanks they are previously tanking, and these needed to be killed one by one. The second time a Bennu is revived, they turn it into a big Bennu, which does a lot more damage and needs to be killed as soon as possible. If 2 big Bennus are alive and close to each other, they buff each other and do even more damage. So the idea is to only have 1 big Bennu at a time and kill the Bennus in a controlled manner. It sounds complicated, but it was as easy as rotating between point A to point B. Kill Bennu on A, move to B, kill Bennu on B, and small Bennu on B, and then move back to A. kill Big Bennu on A and Small Bennu on A, move back to B, and repeat until all Bennus are dead. Once all Bennus are dead, Phoenix will drop his Firewall, immunity, and immediately cast Brand of Purgatory on a random, ranged, or healer. Whoever got this debuff passed it to the main tank and let both tanks deal with this throughout the remainder of the fight, reducing overall incoming raid-wide damage. Phoenix then casted and spawned Fountains of Fire, which would tether to Phoenix and give him up to 8 damage up stacks unless players stood in the fountain, which instead would damage and inflict the player with a stacking debuff, making them take more damage with each fountain stack. Handling this was pretty easy. We simply had the off tank take 4 stacks, a DPS take 2, and then another DPS take another 2, and alternate the tanks and DPS between each Fountain of Fire. During the fountain, these birds also spawned that either did a dodgeable line AoE or tethered to a player and did an unavoidable line AoE. These persisted while Phoenix casted Flames of Rebirth, becoming untargetable and leaving behind some fire AoEs to dodge along with the bird AoEs, which wasn't too bad, but the more constricted room did lead to potential deaths. Then Phoenix will come back down and repeat the phase until he's either dead or the party hits in rage. Phoenix was a really memorable fight for me and holds a lot of nostalgia. It was a bit much for a third fight in a tier, but I think considering the circumstances that it is Phoenix you're fighting, it was pretty justified for it being this way, and after defeating Phoenix for the first time, you're rewarded with this sick-ass cinematic, showing a battle between Phoenix and Bahamut, which pretty much explains what happened to Louis Suarez after failing to seal Bahamut with the power of the 12th. Like, this was super cool, and it's kind of sad we haven't got anything like this again in a raid tier, but that's maybe because this cutscene was so important to tying up the remaining loose ends of the 1.0 story. Then we get to the final fight in this raid tier, Turn 13's Bahamut Prime. Now this fight, like Phoenix, was long and mechanical with multiple phases and probably the hardest hitting encounter in Around Reborn. Not the hardest, that still goes to Savage Nail and Melusine. Phase 1 Bahamut used Flare Breath, a large frontal cone AoE on the tank dealing heavy damage, Flatten, a hard-hitting tank buster, Mega Flare, which drops 4 large avoidable AoEs on 3 to 4 players, Splash Damage AoE on 3 to 4 players, and marking 2 to 4 players for a stack. If anyone came into the stack who wasn't marked, they would instantly die. If there was a player who was missing who was marked for the stack, they would also instantly die if they were targeted. Or if the group was targeted, well, they'd have to pray that they don't take as much damage. For this, everyone would lightly spread out and make sure behind Bahamut was clear for the stack. And the final mechanic was Earthshaker, which targeted 2 random players with a tether and hit them 3 times and drops a puddle for each hit. Anyone in between these hits would also get a hit, so it's important to drag these tethers to the left and right of Bahamut while the rest of the group stays in the middle. At around 76%, Bahamut will push into phase 2 and cast Giga Flare, a heavy hitting raid wide, after which an ad spawns, which will tether to the boss and buff each other if it gets too close. So when we started this fight, we dragged Bahamut more south to avoid this. We burn the ad down fast, otherwise it'll fire liquid hells at random players and limit our movement throughout this phase, which isn't good because Bahamut also casts Flare Star while the ad is up, which spawns these orbs that tether to random players and needs to be taken and split amongst the party. Each orb taken inflicts the player with a stack of Suffocated Will. Non-tanks only took up to 2 stacks of this, while tanks could take 3. As the more stacks you have, the more damage you will receive from Bahamut's upcoming attack, Rage of Bahamut. Throughout this phase, Bahamut will continue to use Flare Breaths, Flattens, and Mega Flares, but now Mega Flares have an extra mechanic, spawning a tower under a random player that needed to be taken, otherwise it will explode and pretty much wipe the raid. This phase repeats until 52%. At this time, Bahamut will cast 1 last Giga Flare, disengage, and then we enter the ad phase. We head to the middle, wait for these 2 dive bomb marks to appear, and then we spread out as we dodged because we also got some Mega Flare mechanics to deal with. People with stacks go middle and everyone else remained outside. Then the real ad phase begins. 2 ads spawn, a Pain of Mericidia and a Blood of Mericidia, and everything here is time-based, so ads need to die as fast as possible, abiding by their mechanics. The Pain was just a heavy hitter with a frontal and back cleave. The Blood switched between magic immunity and physical immunity and was our priority to kill. After a while, 3 gusts of Mericidia would spawn, and these were taken by the tank who had the Blood, because if these gusts got too close to the Pain will eat them, get his HP back, and have a permanent damage upstack, which spelt trouble. Then 2 Sins of Mericidia will spawn, heavy hitters that we had both tanks pick 1 up each. We stack them up and burn them down as fast as possible. Then we hope our DPS was enough because another set of dive bombs appear, which we handle like normal. After which a Storm of Mericidia spawns in the center, which looks identical to Tuantania and borrows her 2 abilities, Plummet and Death Sentence, and will drop a Neuralink upon death. More ads will continue to spawn throughout this phase, a Blood, another set of 3 Gusts, a Sin, and eventually a Pain, which will be killed last. Then Bahamut will do one last dive bomb and prepare to cast Terror Flare. Everyone had to be standing in the neural link which dropped from the storm, and we needed to tank Limit Break free to survive, along with shields and mitigation from our healers. After surviving Terror Flare, we enter the final phase. Bahamut introduces one new mechanic in this phase, Akmorn, a multi-hit shared tank buster that deals pretty substantial damage on the first hit and about half for the following hits, with a hit being added for every Akmorn casted throughout this phase. Other mechanics got new additions like Mega Flare spawns 2 towers now rather than 1, and 2 players got these Tempest Wing tethers for every Mega Flare and Earthshaker cast. That causes an area around them for some pretty big damage, and anyone else caught by this will also receive the damage and get knocked back. These tethers could be intercepted low, so we had both our main and off tank grab these tethers to reduce the overall damage on the party. Oh, and Bahamut also threw out Giga Flares during this phase, just in case there wasn't enough incoming raid-wide damage. All these mechanics repeat until either Bahamut is dead or you reach the Enrage, which is a 15-second Giga Flare cast that will instantly wipe the raid. This tier also popularized the use of poison potions, which could be used in tandem with stat enhancing potions to increase overall damage and meet the DPS check a lot more comfortably. For a change, World First for turn 13 was claimed by another group, the Crezia, a Japanese-based trick company. Overall, a pretty damn good fight, but the difficulty here really was just the insane amount of damage Bahamut did, rather than how mechanically challenging he was, as they were pretty simple compared to the likes of Nail. Of course, with a new raid tier came a new weekly tome and gear set, Allagan Tomestone of Poetics. Yup, the tomes that are used today for previous expansion gear and relic items originally came from A Realm Reborn and were the final tomestone. Just a fun little fact. In addition to this, Soldier was no longer limited to a weekly cap, mythologies were discontinued but could be traded for soldiery, and philosophy were completely removed, so if you were still holding on to philosophy, they would be lost forever, which wasn't a huge deal, but you'd feel kind of silly. And that was everything for patch 2.4 until 2.42, which included several nerfs to the second coil, primarily targeting turn 6, 7, and 8, to make it more accessible and farmable for players. These nerfs included things like Raphage's Blighted Bouquet no longer one-shotting, turn 7's Petrifaction now only lasting 10 seconds, and petrified players no longer being immediately killed upon taking damage, reducing the damage the turn 8 landmines deal, and adding Echo. Then patch 2.45 came along and gave us the 7th stage to the Zodiac Relic weapon. This one involved 4 quests. Each one has you collect a bunch of materials by spending Gil, Grand Company Seal, Soldiery, and a few items were also obtainable by crafting them yourself or buying them from the market board and found in dungeons. It was a lot, but again it did do a good job in keeping us busy until the next major update. This patch also brought the highly requested Eternal Bond system, which at the time was actually quite celebrated for allowing same-sex marriage, which is kind of crazy to think about because of how normal that should be. But I guess 2014 was a different time. January the 20th, 2015, patch 2.5 before the fall launches. Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn's final major patch before the much anticipated Heavensward expansion. 2.5 brought with it more MSQ and Hildebrand quests, the third and final Alliance raid, 3 new dungeons, the Keeper of the Lake, the Wanderer's Palace Hard, and the Andropar Keep Hard, 4 new trials, a new PvP game mode, Slaughter, the Gold Saucer, and the 8th and final step to the Zodiac Relic weapon, along with numerous other changes and additions. Patch 2.5 released in 2 parts, with part 1 bringing 8 new MSQ quests, and part 2 bringing 16, and none of which were pruned by patch 5.3. Part 1 tied up the remaining loose ends on the A Realm Reborn story, and we got the Keeper of the Lake dungeon and the Chrysalis trial fight. The Keeper of the Lake is another dungeon that has undergone some changes. Its overall dungeon pathing remains the same, with some changes to all of its bosses. The first boss, Einhander, littered explosive small and large ceruleum tanks around the map. If these were damaged by the boss, they would set on fire and explode shortly after. The small ones exploded for a small AoE around them, and the large one did a room-wide AoE. These could be hit by players to move them out of the AoEs to prevent them from being damaged and exploding. Now these ceruleum tanks are simply dodgeable AoEs. The second boss, Magitech Gunship, remains mostly the same, except it used to leave these fire puddles, which made being a melee absolutely miserable on this fight. Midgard Summer, the third boss, has probably seen the most significant updates, and is the highlight here, as his fight was completely overhauled to be a more standard dungeon boss fight. In A Realm Reborn, this fight had 2 ad phases where Midgard Summer would go invulnerable and resurrect one of his dragons. The first needed to be tanked far away from him, while the second needed to be tanked close to him to avoid giving them buffs. About halfway through these ad phases, another ad would spawn that was essential to kill as fast as possible, as it dropped a field general generator, and this needed to be activated during animad version to avoid the damage from the cast. If this was activated too early or too late, the cast would simply wipe the raid, so it was pretty important to activate this in time. Other mechanics in this fight weren't really an issue, it was just a bit repetitive, going from attacking Midgard Summer, he goes immune, kill ads, attack Midgard Summer, he goes immune, kill ads, and then kill Midgard Summer. Then of course we have the Chrysalis. It being a story fight, it was nothing crazy complicated, but that didn't stop people from having trouble with the fight, and until the fight became more common knowledge, wipes were sure to happen. Mostly during the meteor phase for a few reasons. Tanks not soaking the meteors, healers not realizing the damage they need to heal, or not enough DPS on the meteor. But the more people who learned the fight and realized that you could pre-buff before going into the next phase and get like 2-minute plus of cooldowns helped a lot, and just using limit break free on the meteor. This wasn't really changed, but it's just a lot easier now with how much more powerful everyone is. Still, I wish they would make this trial a solo instance, as I see no reason why this requires a new player to wait in a queue to find 7 other people, either on the same section or from trial roulette. It's kind of just ridiculous when it could very easily just be a solo instance. Part 2, on the other hand, released with patch 2.55 and was the bridge between a Realm Reborn story and Heavensward, and has us build relations with the Ish Guardians, but also had some of the most climactic cutscenes leading up to this point, and made the entire story of a Realm Reborn worth it. And I really do feel like if you skipped past a Realm Reborn, you may have missed out on some of the most intense storytelling that Final Fantasy XIV has to offer, but hey, that's just my opinion. Either way, Part 2 came with another trial, the Steps of Faith. A big siege-like trial where players had to stop Vishap from reaching Ishgard with the likes of cannons and dragonators. I mean dragon killers. Ads spawned that at least one tank needed to pick up and group by Vishap. 2 players were delegated cannon and snare duty, and 1 player was to use the dragon killer, which meant at least half the group had a responsibility. The snares were needed for the 2nd and 3rd dragon killer hits, otherwise the hits would miss, and the group lost out on a massive amount of damage, which was important because Vishap had a lot of HP and missing 1 or 2 of these could end badly. There were some powder kegs at the end, but even those couldn't make up for the 2 missed shots. And if Vishap reached the end and destroyed the final gate, it resulted in failure, making the group start over, and that made things pretty tense for a story trial. In patch 2.57, the Steps of Faith was nerfed substantially. Vishap and his ad's HP and damage they dealt were reduced, which made the trial considerably easier and less prone to failure, as missing 1 or 2 hits from the dragon killers no longer resulted in failure. In fact, you could pretty much ignore them and still clear the fight. Wasn't recommended, but it was possible. And now the trial has since been removed and replaced by a solo instance with patch 6.2, which is overall an improvement over the original, and should have been the case since the start. Although I have a soft spot for the original and the memories I made through trial roulette, but my only real gripe is the new iteration doesn't use the Steps of Faith music for very long, and reverts to the goofy ass sounding default boss theme, but it's pretty cool nevertheless. This patch also added Earthsfont, a trial fight with Odin. Originally, Odin was a Fate exclusive boss, only spawning during the tension weather condition, and gathered dozens of players who would ultimately throw their bodies at Odin until he died. It was quite the spectacle, like a server-wide event, but it did rely on the weather condition, and although the Fate still exists, making him a trial fight actually made fighting Odin a lot more accessible. Although Odin is just a normal mode trial, easy isn't the word I'd use to describe him, as he can prove quite the challenge to the uninitiated, due to his insane amounts of outgoing damage with heavy hitting tank cleaves, raid busters, AoEs, and bleeds, and his strict DPS check at the end. Still, for those with a bit more experience, he wasn't too bad and was easily clearable in a few pulls of the instance, which made it a shame he didn't have a harder version like Extreme, but unfortunately that's the case for a lot of these type of trials, which I honestly feel is like a waste, but that's just me. With the conclusion of the main scenario also came the final of the Crystal Tower raid series, with the World of Darkness. And just like the previous 2 raids, this one hasn't changed in of itself, but rather we've got a lot more stronger by dealing a lot more damage and taking a lot less now. That some of these bosses don't even get a chance to really shine. They'll still present most of their mechanics though, it's just a matter of how much less punishing ignoring these have become. Angry Mainu, the first boss in this raid, used to be such a wall for the Alliance, and sometimes even resulted in a successful vote abandon, with the most problematic mechanic being the roulette and his ads. If these ads weren't killed fast enough, they do massive raid-wide damage that could kill an unprepared Alliance, and if the hourglasses weren't killed in time, anyone caught in the lit area were given no time to dodge and instantly killed. These 2 things combined and things could really domino effect. work. Maybe a healer died and nobody is healing the main tank. Maybe the main tank dies, and then the boss is loose, cleaving the group and killing players one by one. And things just became too out of control to really recover. If the Alliance made it past the first boss, they should have no problem clearing from here on out. The second boss, Five-Headed Dragon, didn't really cause any issues however, and what you see now is what we got, except it just dies a lot faster and the slimes exploding isn't going to wipe the raid like it used to. The third boss, Cerberus, and this is where things got a bit tricky with no coordinated strategy, as everyone was a bit all over the place. Tanks having an aggro competition with the boss while the ads ran rampant, multiple players from each alliance going into the stomach and not knowing who is going to do the change. So that's why we had to come up with the ABC. A for ads, B for belly, and C for chains. And ever since then, everyone knows what to do upon reaching Cerberus. And finally, the fourth boss, Cloud of Darkness. Again, not really much difference here to how we had it back in the day. Tanks take a lot of damage, AoEs target players need to be kited, clouds spawn that need to be stood in front of and killed, and the ad phase spawns 3 ads that each alliance needs to take. Relatively simple stuff and caused no issues even back in the Realm Reborn days. She just took a bit longer to kill, but that's the same for all of these bosses. Other than a bunch of small changes, additions, and quality of life features, that was it for patch 2.5. But it didn't take long for patch 2.51 to release, and with it came the Gold Saucer update, and that was pretty huge. We got Chocobo racing and breeding, triple triad and card collecting, a new currency MGP with new cosmetic rewards like glamours, minions and mounts, gates, minigames, and the jumbo and mini cackpot, which by the way only one ticket could be purchased on a weekly and daily basis compared to the now free tickets. But yeah, it was a lot, and the player base didn't really have anything else better to do, so a majority of us interacted with this content. Collecting triple triad cards was an addiction of mine that I did alongside working towards my relic weapon, and that's because along with the Gold Saucer also came the 8th and final stage of the Zodiac relic weapon, Zeta. This step revolves around purchasing a total of 12 Mahatmas with tomes and charging them up with light to awaken them. I remember when we first heard the name Mahatmas and assumed that it will be another fate grind. Luckily it was just another light grind, so it wasn't that bad, but again, was enough to keep us occupied. And that was really it. We had a few patches to keep us busy. Patch 2.55 added the second half of the story and removed the weekly restriction of Final Coil. Patch 2.56 and 2.57 added Echo to the Final Coil. And then we waited for Heavensward. And that was a Realm Reborn, and by watching this video you should have a good perspective of how it was, why it's considered so special, an understanding of how dense a Realm Reborn was in terms of adding onto the game with new content and features, and just how much of a frickin' genius Yoshi P and his team is. Looking back at Realm Reborn, it's easy to just think it's this empty, hollow shell with barely any content, because comparatively to Stormblood, Shadowbringers, and Endwalker, it kind of is. And sure, it doesn't have a Savage, or Ultimate, or Deep Dungeons, or Exploration Zones, or Criterion Dungeons, but that's completely ignoring the foundation that a Realm Reborn created. It is, by all accounts, why we have Heavensward, Stormblood, Shadowbringers, Endwalker, and soon Dawntrail. It is the reason we have one of the most thriving MMORPGs to this day, and the beauty of Final Fantasy XIV is you can go back to a Realm Reborn and enjoy all this content in almost its original state. The story is definitively good. Housing is an integral part of the game. Gold Saucer remains a fun side activity. Coils are still fun to run and experience the story of. Obtaining the extreme mounts as a collector is fulfilling. Getting a Zodiac relic weapon is still a massive grind, and a lot of quality of life features have changed the way we tackle encounters, like the ability to place waymarks, to define strategies, which we have our Realm Reborn to thank for. So yeah, I enjoyed a Realm Reborn then, and I appreciate it now. Not only has it a lot of nostalgia with me, but it also made the game I play and love today. The game that gave me something I might have been missing in my life. Fulfillment. I know it sounds sad, and I'm not asking for pity, but I didn't do great in school or college, which you can probably tell by my pronunciation of some words and lack of vocabulary. And I didn't make many friends either. But Final Fantasy XIV has given me those things. It's given me a community. It's given me a platform to improve myself. It's the reason this channel exists, and most importantly, it's given me kind of a purpose. And it's the reason this video even exists. So thank you, Final Fantasy. And thank you for watching.